webinar go? Okay, all right. We've already started. So thank you guys for taking the time to join us here, both in person and for those participating on phone, for the Home and Community-Based Services Self-Assessment Training. My name is Susan Crow. I'm with the Department of Developmental Services, Federal Programs Division. In alignment with the California statewide transition plan and the state's efforts to comply with the requirements of the final rules, the department has contracted with public consulting groups, who are going to introduce themselves in a moment, to facilitate training and provide guidance on a variety of topics relating to the final rule. The department is committed to ensuring that key stakeholders, such as you all, our partners at the regional centers, providers, individuals served, and family members, all have the tools that you need to understand the purpose of the self-assessment and its place in California's overall process for aligning services with the HCBS final rule. Today we're going to focus on the purpose of the self-assessment, who needs to complete it, the expectations for completion, including gathering input from those who receive services. We'll discuss each of the federal requirements, and we'll provide resources for once the training has concluded. I'd like to take a moment to address up front the concerns with the online portal being used to complete the self-assessment. Some providers did not receive an email with login information. Some of you might be here in the room. We're actively working to resolve those accessibility concerns. If you're one of those providers who did not receive login information, please get in touch with your regional center. You can also find a link in eBilling when you log in to eBilling to create an account within the portal for OIG Compliance Now, which is who we're doing this online assessment through. So we'll provide emails at the end of the training for who to contact for technical assistance. Again, thank you all for being here today. Nothing in here today is top secret information. We encourage everybody to share what they learned today within their communities, and we'll turn it over to Public Consulting Group. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and give you a quick introduction to Public Consulting Group, otherwise known as PCG. As Susie mentioned, we have contracted with the department to support these trainings related to the HCBS final rule. We've worked in almost a dozen states at this point, helping the state and their providers and other stakeholders come into compliance with the final rule. So everything from conducting self-assessments, on-site assessments, helping with desk reviews, supporting efforts in their statewide transition plan as a whole. My name is Amanda Albee. I am a senior consultant with PCG. I am based out of our Indianapolis, Indiana office. And since coming to PCG almost 4 years ago, this has been the primary focus of all of my efforts at PCG, is working with states in whatever their needs and efforts are in order to meet that March of 2022 deadline with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Prior to joining PCG, I was the policy director for Indiana Medicaid, and I would go ahead and turn it over to the rest of their team to introduce themselves as well.
It's a little hard to hear you in the back.
Okay.
So I don't know. I might keep the.
I can be louder as well. Thank you. Okay. Oh, that sounds good.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elsa Bach. I am a business analyst with Public Consulting Group. I've been with PCG now for almost 2 years, and most of my work has centered around the HCBS final rule, as well as person-centered planning, specifically training initiatives in many different states.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Cohen. I'm a consultant with Public Consulting Group. Similar to Elsa, most of my work centers around the HCBS final rule, working with many different states in that area. Before working at PCG, I worked for Mayor Marty Walsh in the city of Boston on the Disabilities Commission, and I really focused on special education and education policy, and really enjoyed doing this work, and look forward to being here today and working with you all. Audio.
Okay. Also on the slide is Sarah Salisbury. She is the what we call the engagement manager for this work. So she is the state's primary point of contact for our contracts. We also have Kathy Anderson on the phone. Kathy, can you introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Anderson. I'm a senior advisor with Public Consulting Group. I've been with the company about 6 years. I worked for them 6 years, an additional 6 years ago in the early 2000s, and I came back to work with them primarily because of the focus of the HCBS settings rule. I have over 30 years of experience as a professional in the intellectual and developmental disabilities field and served as the state director for developmental disability services in 3 different states. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. As Susie mentioned, our main goal for today is to discuss the self-assessment, the process, how to complete it, and give you all of the tools and resources. So once you have that access to the portal, you can get in and hit the ground running. Before we get into the self-assessment specifically and go through each of the questions, we just wanted to give you an overview of how that self-assessment fits into this process as a whole, where it comes from, and how it fits into the settings rule and the state's obligation as they review services and settings and make sure that they come into compliance. As Susie mentioned, and I'm sure you all know at this point, each state, as part of the final rule, was tasked with developing a statewide transition plan. That plan is just what it's called. It is the state's their information that they're giving to CMS that tells CMS how they are going to, what steps they're specifically going to take to make sure that themselves as a state and all of their settings that receive HCBS funding, home and community-based services funding, are coming into or will come into alignment by that March of 2022 deadline. As part of that process, each state is conducting education, outreach, and training with all of its stakeholders, providers, in your case, regional centers as well, individuals receiving services and their families in particular. Each state is also tasked with doing a systemic assessment, which is also outlined in their statewide transition plan. That systemic assessment is where the state looks at their own rules and regulations, policies, procedures, practices, and develops a plan for how they're going to update their own rules and let CMS know, okay, here are the steps that we're going to take with our system. The next step to that is the site assessment process. So what California is conducting in order to assess each of their settings is to start with a self-assessment. That's the process that we will be going over today. Once providers complete that self-assessment, the state will engage in a site assessment process. We'll touch on that briefly, especially in the next steps piece. But that site assessment process, the goal is to validate all of the information from the self-assessment process. Once the state's collected that information, and the regional centers in the state have worked collectively to develop an initial recommendation for how a specific setting aligns with the final rule. Settings will work with their regional center primarily and the state to go through the remediation process. So any area that may have been identified as not currently in compliance, you'll work through that regional center to develop a plan and make sure that everybody can come into alignment by that deadline. So individuals can continue to receive services where they choose to receive services, and settings can continue to receive their HCBS funding. And then lastly, the statewide transition plan also outlines the state's plan for how they're going to report all of this information back to CMS. Objectives of this training specifically, as I mentioned, primary goal is to go over the self-assessment process, make sure everybody understands what their obligations are for filling out the assessment, how to complete the assessment, and all of the information that you should collect or review as part of that process. You will hear us say throughout this training a lot that the most important piece of this is collecting information from the individuals receiving services themselves and their families. The whole crux of the final rule is really about individual choice, individual experience. And so everyone that is completing a self-assessment should make sure that they're really engaging individuals as part of this process. And so for each question, we'll go over just some ideas and thoughts on how to do that. And, you know, if you have questions along the way, please feel free to stop and we can go over those. Obviously, we're going to look at this process as a whole, how it aligns with the state's overall plan for bringing all of their services and settings into alignment with the final rule. We'll give you the list of covered services, and in particular who this self-assessment applies to, who should be completing a self-assessment, the expectations for completing the self-assessment. As I mentioned, strategies and guidance, so how different things that you can look at, documentation, how to collect input from individuals and their families, all of those pieces that can go into helping you craft the most comprehensive response to each one of these questions. And then we'll conclude with some additional available resources that you can look to. In particular, if you're still kind of confused about certain provisions of the final rule or how it may apply to some of these questions, we had done an overview training several months back, and I know that's posted as well, so we'll touch base on those specifically. So we've kind of covered this, but this is just a breakdown of the agenda. Again, we're going to go over the self-assessment process pretty comprehensively, look at those resources. We will take time at the end for questions and answers. I think we have more than enough time blocked off to cover the content and to be able to address all of your questions fully. So if you have a specific question that comes up as we go throughout, again, feel free to raise your hand, but we'll have time at the end as well. We will also cover the exit survey. We would love your feedback at the end of this on how we did, if you've got all of the information you need, or anything that you think might be added to some future trainings to make sure that we cover. Any questions so far? Can you all hear me in the back? Good now? All right, perfect. So if you attended the overview training, you'll know that there were probably about 5 or 6 slides that covered a lot of common terms. I'm not going to cover all of those, but we wanted to show you the ones that you will likely hear today. I try not to speak in acronyms, but as with government work, we tend to talk in acronyms a lot. So if you hear any of these, are the ones you're going to be most likely to hear today. But again, I'll try to communicate them and not shorten any of them. You all should be mostly familiar with these terms. If you hear HCBS, it's referring to home and community-based services, which are the services that most of you all provide. CMS is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. You all know we're here because of the HCBS settings final rule. So this is the rule that was released back in 2014, and states have until March of 2022 to ensure all of their settings are coming into alignment with all of the characteristics and criteria that are laid out in that final rule. We've already talked about the statewide transition plan, for short STP, and then the self-assessment. So this is the survey that you all will be engaging in. It is distributed to providers, and the purpose is to make sure that you're collecting input from individuals that you serve and their families, and assist the state and the regional center in determining that initial level of compliance with the final rule. So a broad overview, again, of the assessment process. This is where the state takes a look at their settings that are specifically receiving funding to provide home and community-based services. We are focusing on the self-assessment process today, and again, subsequent to that will be an on-site assessment process. The state will be looking to engage in a sample based on who completes the self-assessment. So they'll take all of those responses and develop a sampling methodology from there to determine what sites will receive an on-site. That will be truly a random sample, so there's no way to know at this point which sites will be selected for that, with the exception of any site that does not complete a self-assessment. If any setting does not complete that self-assessment, they will be selected for an on-site. The main thing I want to emphasize through this entire assessment process is the goal is not to terminate services, close settings, alter anything in that way. It is simply to determine where settings are currently in their alignment with the final rule. Yes.
I have a question. If you're going to phase out one of the programs, do you still do the assessment because you're phasing it out June 30th?
I would default that question back to your regional center and DDS. Okay, yeah, I would call your regional center specifically and walk, because your regional center is who's going to be analyzing that self-assessment. So I would have that conversation with them specifically. I don't know, Susie, if you have anything you would add. Okay. So this just kind of lays out on the timeline the assessment process as a whole. Obviously, we are conducting the self-assessment now. We'll go over the due date, but that'll conclude March of 2022. And from the time that the self-assessment responses are collected, settings should start working on their transition activities at that point. Work with their regional center to develop a plan for how you're going to remediate any of those areas that you identified during that assessment process. So really take a hard look at your programs, how you design services, how you implement services, and take that feedback that you receive from individuals and their families very seriously. There's a lot of work that could have begun already by now. And so looking to your regional center in the state to provide the education, training, and support to make sure that you come into compliance. That is definitely the goal at the end of the day, is making sure everyone that chooses to come into alignment with the final rule can. We have the timeline for the on-site reviews. They are currently scheduled to take place the later part of 2020. During that on-site assessment process, who the assessors that are conducting those on-site reviews will be collecting feedback from individuals as part of that process. So it's important to be able to validate that information as much as possible with the information that was collected during the self-assessment process. And then from there, you will see in the statewide transition plan, DDS's plan for ongoing monitoring. So while we have the March of 2022 deadline to come into alignment, states still have an obligation after that point to continue to monitor these settings and make sure that they stay in alignment with the final rule. Lastly, the last thing I want to point out is this consumer input and involvement. This should be consistent, reviewed, collected, evaluated throughout this entire assessment process. Again, that is the whole crux of the final rule, is what does an individual's day look like? How does an individual experience a certain setting? That's the lens that all of this information should be viewed from. I think most of you have probably seen this before. You should be familiar with all of these services, but these are the services that are impacted by the HCBS final rule. And so if you provide any of these services in your setting, you should be completing a self-assessment for each service per setting. I'm not going to read the list off to all of you. I know you have the printout, and this is something that is outlined in the statewide transition plan and that you can reference back to later on as well. If you have any questions about services you provide, I know the question we got about if you're closing out a specific service or program, just contact your regional center and direct those questions to them, and they can help you work through whether you actually need to complete a self-assessment for a particular service. So this outlines the purpose of the self-assessment process. Again, this is really a way for the state to have that initial level of review of the settings that are providing HCBS services. And really the most productive part, I think, about this process is for providers to take a look at their own programs, really take a hard look about the services you're providing, collecting that input from individuals and families, and getting a really comprehensive understanding of whether that setting is actually operating and individuals are experiencing that setting the way that you intend to run your program. The other thing that this process does is it gives that framework or foundation for you all to develop a plan to come into alignment with the final rule. So, any area that you see as part of your self-assessment process that you may not be quite hitting the mark yet, that's okay. You don't have to be in compliance as of this moment. Your policies, procedures, practices don't have to be in alignment right now. The whole goal of this process is to take that evaluation of where you currently stand and then work with your regional center to get where you need to get. And again, you're going to hear this a lot, and I'm just going to continue to emphasize making sure that you are looking at that individual's experience. Speak with individuals, speak with them and their families, and really get an idea for, you may think you're doing a great job and you're doing everything that your policies and practices say you're doing, but is that how your individuals are experiencing that setting? And again, if you're not in compliance with all of the requirements as of this moment, that is perfectly fine. There is still time to work with your regional center, and they will help you develop a plan and work through that plan to make sure that you can come into alignment. Any questions so far about the purpose? Everybody understand the purpose and kind of why we're here and why we're doing this? Anything in the chat box so far? All right. As Susie mentioned early on, some of you may have received an email already with login information to the portal. Some of you may not. Obviously, the department is working on that, so just continue to look for those emails. And if you're not getting anything, make sure you're contacting your regional center. You will have until March 31st to complete the self-assessment. So hopefully these trainings will be a good resource for you to, once you get that email, be able to log in and really start moving on those questions. I strongly encourage you not to wait until the last minute. Some of these questions are relatively straightforward, but if you're really taking a hard look at your program and you're collecting the input, reviewing your own documentation, and understanding what's happening on a day-to-day basis, it's going to, take you some time to make sure you're formulating a comprehensive response. So don't give yourself about a week to fill these out, especially if you have numerous services per setting. Yes? Who is targeted to need to receive those logins? So Susie, the question is who's targeted to receive that email?
Yeah, so every provider who was on that list, in the slide we just saw recently, we collected a list of providers from each regional center, and those providers were sent emails, and so that's how we determined who got an email. Eventually, everybody who receives who provides one of those services should be able to log in through their email or by logging into e-billing and going through that link. And their information should be uploaded. So you only want one response per agency? No. Your agency has many different services that you operate under. Do you want a self-assessment for each service? Yeah, so just to repeat the question for anybody who didn't hear or those on the webinar, the question was if you provide multiple services under one agency, a survey should be completed, an assessment should be completed for each service that you operate, each vendor that you have at the regional center.
So to clarify, that would be, you would fill the survey or the self-assessment out for each vendor number you have that falls under one of those service codes on the list.
Yes, it's that vendor number service code combination. Yes. Yeah.
Will it just go to one person for that login and that email?
So Susie's coming back to answer a question. The question was if it would just go to one person.
Yeah, so it should go to anybody who has that vendor, who's connected to that vendor number. You should get a survey. It'll be connected in the portal that you log in as an agency who provides several services. So you maybe have several vendor numbers or vendors within your regional center. Those will all show up in the portal for you. So it'll go to one person.
If one person in that agency, like the executive director or someone else, it won't go to each staff member that's connected to that.
No, sorry, yeah, to clarify, it will not go to every person within the, every staff within the provider, just one person who whoever that contact is. I also want to say, some of the, we want to really focus on the content of the training today too, and so the technical questions, we definitely want to address because I think that's a big part of getting through today, but technical questions too, we'll be providing a resource at the end of the training for those types of questions that you can send. I saw another hand.
It was a technical question.
Okay.
Well, and hopefully as we start going through the specific questions, some of that content will be covered. But if not, we can definitely address those. I think we'll have plenty of time at the end. I think if it's not been clear yet, the other main point I want to highlight about the self-assessment process is that it is mandatory. So again, every vendor number, service code combination should make sure that there is a response for that particular combination, and anyone that does not complete a self-assessment, any setting that doesn't have a self-assessment could be subject to an on-site assessment, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't want anybody to also kind of be timid or, intimidated by the on-site assessment process. It's just another way to evaluate where a setting currently stands in terms of their level of compliance. And they actually have given us an opportunity, given states an opportunity to get really good information, especially from individuals receiving services. A lot of it is overwhelmingly positive and productive as part of this assessment process. So don't let any of that put fear in your eyes or anything like that. I will speak for myself. Every on-site I've done, by the end of it, every single provider has said, that's not as bad as I thought. Like, this really was an easy process. So you all know you do great work. You all know that you have a lot of individuals and families that are receiving good services and supports as part of your programming. So this is really just an opportunity to highlight all of that. So for completing the self-assessment, you will log into the portal, read the instructions. We highly recommend reading the entire self-assessment before you start answering any questions. Print it off. I know the department's also going to send a PDF version of the self-assessment out. So read that as many times as you need to before you start going in and answering each question. It just kind of helps you understand as a whole what's being asked, and it can help point you in the right direction of your own documentation and things that you should take a look at, and the types of questions that you should be seeking input from individuals and their families. Make sure that once you start completing the self-assessment that you answer every single question. All questions are mandatory. I'm not sure, I don't think the portal will let you skip a question, but on the off chance there's a glitch and you don't answer something, it will come through as an incomplete assessment. Incompletes, again, will go into that same bucket as if you didn't complete a self-assessment at all. Yeah.
Okay, so once you start an assessment, you then start it and finish it?
No, because you can save throughout. There will be a save button. I'll cover this too, but once it's submitted, it is submitted. So that's also why I encourage, using that printout and reading each question before you start answering. But you may, obviously, you all have a lot of work to do, a lot of other priorities, so you can save it and go back to it later. And I would encourage you, with each page that you go through, anytime you add content, make sure you're clicking that save button.
Can you also download it to your own laptop?
Yeah, so with the PDF that comes through, you can save that. I think once you're in the portal, we'll go through this. Once you submit, you can print off your responses as well. But when you get that PDF version, I would go ahead and save that to another location to make sure you have that easily accessible. As part of this process, kind of think ahead of time of how you're going to gather that input. And again, we'll go through each question and kind of give you some ideas and thoughts on that. One thing in particular, use, if you have any existing groups in your setting, any consumer groups, family groups that come in, community advisory boards, any of that you would want to seek input from your setting, go to those first. If you're a residential setting and you have a resident group that meets monthly to go over issues, schedule a focus group with them during one of their regularly scheduled meetings. Make sure that you're just using what resources you already have in place to do those things. You can also always print off that PDF survey and hand it out to individuals and their families and ask them to complete it from their perspective. You know, work with them, make sure they understand the questions, but you really want to make sure that anytime you're collecting that input from individuals and their families in particular, that it's coming from that individual's perspective. We've unfortunately seen sometimes during the on-site visits when we are interviewing individuals, we might see some staff interference where they'll say, oh, well, Bob just likes to complain. Bob complains about everything. Well, maybe there's a reason Bob's complaining. You know, don't be afraid to actually speak to those individuals that you feel like maybe are very vocal. There could be something behind that. So make sure you're really taking their perspective and understanding where they're coming from and why they're vocalizing some of the things that they are. And understand there's a lot of individuals that have really positive things to say about the programs that they're in. They enjoy the setting. They feel like they have choices and flexibility. So you might hear things on both sides, but make sure you take all levels of input seriously. If they're nonverbal, it's the same thing that you would use to help support that individual. What are their nonverbal cues? What are some of the other ways that you use to communicate with those individuals? Even if they are nonverbal, they still have ways or methods of communicating. So make sure that you're utilizing those to understand or help them understand the question. Yeah, you do not have to speak to every single individual that you serve. Understand that some of these settings are very large and serve a lot of individuals. Yeah. The key really is to collect input from a variety of individuals. You know, make sure you're not just speaking to one or two. Obviously, if you only support 4 individuals in your setting, then, you know, you still don't have an obligation to speak to all 4. But if you have a setting where you serve 150 individuals, obviously you're under no obligation to communicate and get input from 100 of those individuals. So use your judgment. But again, make sure that it is, you know, an appropriate representation of your program and the individuals that you do support. So with respite, they do not have to complete a self-assessment.
Technically, I can do both, but all I'm doing right now is respite, and so I self-assessment. So when you're filling out the survey, are there questions where they're going to want you to put in specific information that you've gotten from your current client? And if that's so, how does somebody who does not have a current client answer those questions?
Yeah, so this is, sorry. Just to repeat the question, you had asked how to survey folks when you're a provider who doesn't necessarily have a consistent consumers that you support. Is that right? Yeah. I think I do want to chat with you and have you go to your regional center. So I'm not sure that you, the respite provider, will need to fill out an assessment. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I think when you're completing the assessment, then you should be thinking about the people that you're currently supporting. So if that is nobody, then I think you can fill that out for how you would provide the service to somebody.
As far as your own documentation goes, each of the questions will give you a chance to explain how you develop your answer. So include snippets from your current policies and procedures. You don't have to produce any of that documentation as part of the self-assessment process. So you don't have to attach any documentation. And your current documentation doesn't have to be fully up to date and in alignment with where it needs to be by March of 2022 either. Again, the point is to take a look at where you are currently, evaluate your policies, procedures, practices, that individual experience, and all of that goes into just developing, again, that initial level of alignment at this point. If you have handbooks for your individuals that you support, just any types of policies or procedures that are around person-centered planning, individuals' rights, grievance policies, all of those things, consult those. But what you should really be weighing most heavily is what your individuals and their families are saying. If you have a significant number of individuals that are nonverbal and they have guardians in place, speak with those guardians. Really try to get a feel and a good understanding for how those settings are actually experienced by the individuals that are receiving support there. When you see the questions, this just kind of outlines what your response options are. Again, don't be afraid to mark sometimes or partially met or not currently met. There is plenty of time, and definitely the goal of the regional centers and the state is to work with providers to help remediate any of those areas that are not currently where they need to be. When you're developing your response, you should only mark yes or met if that service that you're providing currently meets all of the criteria that are outlined, and individuals are supported really in an individual way. Any type of blanket restriction that's in place, that maybe you have a couple of individuals in your setting that have food restrictions, but as a result, you've put blanket policies in place that limit or restrict access to food for everybody in that setting. Those are the types of things where you're going to want to mark sometimes partially met or not met. Only if you don't either have any modifications or they are addressed on a individual basis, documented in that person-centered plan, that's the times where you would mark yes or met. We will go through what those modifications look like as well, and the type of documentation that should be included in an individual's plan to be able to support that response. Again, we emphasize this here. I cannot say it enough. You do not have to be in compliance as of the moment you're completing that self-assessment. We're just taking a look at where you stand currently.
I have a question.
Yes.
How would you indicate not applicable?
So the question is how you would indicate not applicable. There's not going to be a question that isn't applicable to a setting, with the exception of provider-owned or controlled residential settings. So once you identify which services you provide, if you are not a provider-owned or controlled residential setting, those questions won't even populate for you. So I don't know, Susie, if you want to add anything from the department, but I don't think there's a not applicable option to any of the questions, because the first 5 characteristics or first 5 federal requirements that are outlined are required of every home and community-based setting. So there's not exceptions to any of those.
So for the question about individuals wanting to seek paid employment, if the provider only serves children 6 and under, you would just say no?
So there are sub-questions to that. It's a little bit more comprehensive than that. That's just only in the example that it is a program that provides employment services. I think Susie has something to add.
Yeah, hi. I was just going to say, I think that was Catherine, you asking that question. That, I think, is actually the one not applicable in the entire survey.
There's one.
So, yeah. Mostly, you know, for those who don't provide employment services, and also for residential programs. So that will be, I don't think that will populate in the portal for employment services, or most day services as well. So.
Thank you. And as we go through each of these questions, again, when you're consulting whatever documentation, policies, practices you have, when you're including in your narrative what documentation you reviewed, be very specific and clear in what you're referencing, because that's going to guide your regional center as they analyze your responses. So don't just write in, oh, well, I looked at the resident handbook, or I looked at the staff training log. Point to very specific things that occurred or that you have documented, cite policy numbers. You can actually copy and paste parts of your policies or procedures into that response if you want. Again, though, keep that limited. There will be subsequent validation to all of this, but the clearer you are and the more direct in your response, the easier it's going to be for the regional center to analyze the information that you provided and make that initial determination of alignment with the final rule. modifications, we've touched on this a little bit. Probably some information that you're already familiar with, but the HCBS final rule has stated that you can modify some of those characteristics that should be present in a home and community-based setting, so long as it's done based on an individual need. So again, we're not seeing blanket policies, practices, restrictions in place based on some individuals or one individual in your setting. Any modifications such as access to community, access to food, et cetera, are really based on what an individual's support needs are. And again, that response should only be selected if all of the criteria are met and documented in the individual's plan. So the next slide just kind of gives you a breakdown of what those modifications are and what they should look like. I'm not going to read these to you. These come directly from the final rule. But again, if you have a person-centered planning process in place already, this isn't going to be foreign information to you at all. You're looking at whatever that individual's level of need is. You have implemented things prior to putting a modification or a restriction in place. You are doing an ongoing review of whatever that restriction or modification is. Just because you put, let's say, an individual has to have restricted access to the community for a certain period of time, you're documenting whatever education and support is provided to that individual on an ongoing basis so they understand why that restriction's in place, and it's really looked at as a short-term thing. Go ahead. I see the question.
We do resolution on day cover. So, some of the restrictions that we have to implement come from conservators who make people. So if there's, you don't get much of a say, or the person doesn't get much of a say, that's sort of how that aspect of their life just works out. So, all over again. Okay. Many of the areas where people's lives are restricted comes from their conservator's decision. So the sort of role of us as a service provider or even the person themselves is sort of excluded from the decision making. And the review process is really the court. If somebody investigates it, how is that what we say?
It should still be documented as part of that planning process, and I would imagine that their conservator is part of that planning process. Yeah. There is a way to, in cases like that, or, the question about selecting a setting from other options that are not just specific to individuals with disabilities, there is a way to document as part of this process if you feel like that decision is not always up to your program or your setting, and I think that would probably be the best example of one way that you would want to highlight that, where you don't always have control over what those decisions are.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Catherine, and I'm the HCBS specialist here at ELPIS, and I would just encourage any providers that are facing some pressure from conservators about things they might be concerned about or not in agreement with, to make sure that you're including the regional center as part of the planning team. There's a team that makes up the planning team, and if you have questions about how the final rule is applied with the needs of the individual, you can reach out to your HCBS specialist. And my understanding is that a conservator, while they are granted some authority from the court, they don't trump the federal regulation.
Correct.
They're not writing program design. So if there's kind of a sticky situation and you're not sure how to navigate that, please reach out to your regional center.
Great point, thank you. What we want to make sure that we're not seeing is those family members that may be heavily involved in an individual's life but aren't their conservator, aren't their guardian, but still, because they are very involved, they may take some of that decision-making away. And those are the things that we want to kind of look for on a setting-by-setting basis and make sure that, again, you're speaking with that individual directly and really getting a feel from them what their experience is, what their needs are, and what they want their daily choices and opportunities to be. Any questions on the modifications? I'm sure as part of your program planning process, you're all familiar with that and what should be documented, but feel free to consult that slide back specifically. Again, that language comes directly from the final rules. The next part we want to touch on a little bit is the heightened scrutiny process. So these are going to be the first couple of questions that you see are related to what we call the first two prongs of heightened scrutiny. So there's a presumption of being institutional if your setting is located on the grounds of or co-located with a public or private facility that provides inpatient institutional treatment. So if you're co-located with a skilled nursing facility or co-located with a hospital, there is an inherent presumptive of institutional qualities there. But we'll talk about how to work through that. Heightened scrutiny, it sounds like a very negative or punitive term, but it's actually not. It's the state's opportunity to tell CMS, hey, we attest for this setting. We've collected all of this information. They've done a self-assessment. We've done a site assessment. They have a remediation plan in place, and we feel like this setting meets all of the home and community-based criteria in order to continue to receive funding. There's a very large distinction between being selected for that heightened scrutiny process and just being deemed not compliant at all. So I would just kind of keep that in mind as you work through this process. And again, I don't like the term. I think many states don't like that term because it does sound very negative, but it really is just, it's another way for the state to help that setting remediate and again, attest that this is a home and community-based setting.
What happens if they find you non-compliant for 5 questions or so, or what if you're not compliant with one of those? Like, is there a penalty? Is there...
So the question is what happens if you're found not compliant with any of the questions that are part of the self-assessment process. Again, this is just to get that baseline level of compliance. It's going to be unlikely that you're not really going to be deemed non-compliant on a specific question. You just may not currently align with whatever that criteria is, and that's the goal of the remediation process. So you'll have time over the next roughly year to work with your regional center, to work with the state, and develop that plan for what you're going to do to come into compliance with that specific area. So let's say you have a blanket restriction in place where nobody can leave the setting by themselves. That's something that you can develop a plan for. You can go back to your person-centered planning process, see which individuals maybe you can afford that flexibility and those opportunities to, you know, build a stronger plan with them, work with their regional center to complete that plan. Those are all areas that you can work on over the next year or so to come into compliance.
So let's say it's 2022,
Mm-hmm.
you should be in the final rule, and they come to your facility for an on-site assessment. And, you know, like none of my clients, none of them can really leave on their own. But as long as it's stated, do they really have the IPPs? I mean, what tools will they use to assess this? Like, communicating with the clients, because all my clients are nonverbal.
So as part of completing your self-assessment, you can look at those individual IPs and make sure all of those modifications, all of that criteria is outlined in their IPPs. And if all of that is outlined in there for all of those individuals specifically, then you can mark that you have met those areas. Playing your question out as a whole, though, if, you know, settings, DDS and whoever conducts site assessment isn't going to show up at your door in March of 2022 and say, all right, we're scheduling your on-site. You're not ready this day, sorry. There is a time and a process in place for that. But if there is a setting that once the self-assessment's been completed, the on-site assessment's been completed, and the setting doesn't carry out their remediation plan, the state is, per the final rule, cannot continue to fund sites that are not in compliance as of March of 2022. But there are
rely on the regional center to make sure that they're following that so they can document as well on our IPP.
Absolutely. Yep, it is a comprehensive process, and there is plenty of time to still work with settings. That is the role of the regional center. They have HCBS specialists.
At this point, we're seeing any of that on our IPPs neither, besides, you know, safety, awareness, but like keys to their house.
Yep.
There's certain things that is not documented on there, like they participate during for house meetings, for their activities and their meal planning. That's not on the IPP. So is this everything that they have to do too?
Well, so yeah, I mean, any type of restriction or modification that is put in place for an individual should be documented as part of that IPP.
Is this the restriction or modification?
So the example of a key to a house. If you have an individual that, you know, the setting or is saying, nope, they can't have a key to the house for whatever reason, whatever that need may be, that should be outlined in their plan.
Okay.
As to how that need was assessed, what type of education and support was provided prior to that modification being put in place, and then a plan to look at that on an ongoing basis. Question?
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm from Woodgate Regional Center, also the HCBS specialist, and we're working currently with all of our providers to communicate as much as possible, starting now with the social workers at the regional center, to get ICP addendums. Yes. We have the addendums are going to be able to get for so many people in these providers. So these ICP addendums, obviously, every 3 years. You don't have to wait 3 years. Every year. Right. Some are 3, some are 1. But really encourage you to talk to your regional center social worker regarding those addendums.
Yeah, question.
So as a direct result of this new final rule, et cetera, is that why the IDP process is being changed to the 1-year place to assist with this process? And that's being in compliance? That goes into being presented to me.
So I would say from a final rule perspective, the final rule doesn't say specifically you have to do this every year. But it does say it should be looked at frequently and on an ongoing basis. And I'll defer to Susie on that question specifically about the ICP being done every year.
Yeah, I mean,
3 to 1, sorry.
the ICP is reviewed annually, is my. So, yeah, I mean, I would have that conversation with your regional center if you're feeling that that's, you're on a different process or path.
I know I'm the HCBS evaluator for Far Northern, and so we're actually implementing these rules in our ICP right now. We're starting to put that language in there. So I don't know if all fit in or not.
I think the other thing I would highlight there too is as part of this process, you know, you're assessing your own program. Don't feel like you have to wait on specific things to start those changes. So if don't feel like you're looking at ICPs on an ongoing basis, or if you know certain individuals in your setting have restrictions, you don't have to wait for your year or things like that to really go back and evaluate those and how they're documented in the plan. You can really start doing those things now. The longer you wait, especially if, you know, you take a look at your setting and you don't feel like you're really close to where you need to be in terms of aligning, the sooner you start, the more time you're going to have to feel comfortable with the process, and just really put in the changes in place that you feel like you need to implement in order to come into alignment comfortably before that deadline. Next slide, please. So these are those prongs we've kind of touched on very briefly about needing to take another step further in the verification process to ensuring that your setting is in alignment with all of those home and community-based settings criteria. The first two we touched on. The third one I know has been a little bit of a interesting conversation since the final rule was put out in 2014. Because it speaks to individuals being isolated from the broader community and those not receiving HCBS-funded services. CMS did release a letter in March of 2019 that gave a little bit more guidance and information as to what isolating means. I think originally a lot of it was, while CMS said it wasn't about physical location, that was kind of the focus that was placed on what this actually meant. So there were conversations around gated communities, in particular campus-like settings. And while those types of settings can still be isolating, the guidance that was put out is really to look at how your program, your services are designed and implemented. We have looked at settings that are arguably in a residential community location physically, but very much isolate those individuals from that broader community. So really taking a hard look about how you deliver services and what those individual opportunities and access actually look like on a daily basis. There is not a specific question that addresses that third one in your self-assessment process. So don't feel like you have to focus on that question specifically, but really as you're answering all of these questions, have that in mind. You know, is the way that you deliver services or support individuals unintentionally isolating them from the broader community? A lot of it's going to go back to that planning process. But just kind of take a look at those things. We will see, Jamie, if you don't mind switching, those first two are addressed. Obviously, those are much more black and white conversations and a lot more clear cut for your settings. So there will be questions in the self-assessment that address those specifically. This is an overview of all of the federal requirements as they're broken down in the self-assessment. As we touched on very early on, those last requirements, if you're not a provider-owned or controlled residential setting, those questions aren't even going to populate for you. So we'll go over those questions so you can still see what they are and get a feel for what they are, but some of you may not see all of those requirements populate. The way the self-assessment is broken down from here, so you will see the overarching federal requirement, and then there will be sub-questions to each one of these criteria. So you'll see the full requirement directly as it is worded in the final rule. So the first one is obviously about access to the community. If you're a setting that provides or facilitates employment, obviously that is kind of all-encompassing of this first criteria, but it's really about making sure individuals have the same opportunities and access to that broader community as individuals that are not receiving services. And what will help kind of speak to that overall alignment with that requirement are those sub-questions that you'll see as part of the process. So these are the questions currently in the portal. I don't know if any of you have been able to access it yet, but if you have, these questions should be familiar to you. All of these questions from an assessment process kind of as a whole, other states have asked with their settings. CMS very early on released exploratory questions for residential settings and non-residential settings. So a lot of these questions are structured off of that guidance. One thing that CMS has made very clear is that states can ask their own questions. There's not a standard set of questions that CMS has dictated to states that says you have to ask A, B, C, and D specifically. But what it has said is, and that's kind of why they released those exploratory questions, is to really give states and their stakeholders a feel for the types of questions that should be asked as part of this process. So when you're looking at access to the community and the same opportunities as individuals not receiving services, these are the things that you really want to look for in your program. You know, what types of outings are you offering? What types of activities that include meaningful interaction in the community? Understanding that meaningful means something different to everybody, but that's why it's important to collect that feedback from individuals.
We're in a work program because we have the questions and we've been working on them and having focus groups and talking to some of our consumers, parents. But as part of their plan for services, the first one, if they're in a work program all day, how would you answer that? Because we don't have control over their group outings and activities because they're not in the, they're not in a day program, they're in a work program.
So the question is related to work programs and how they can get those meaningful community interactions when they're spending their time engaging in their work activities. So I would look at how those activities are structured. Are they just the work activities? So give us a couple examples of the work activities.
They work at a warehouse, and so they go to work from 8 to 2. So when they come in, they go to work, and then when they go home, it's time to go home. So we're not involved with activities. We're just involved with work.
Right. So look at how those interactions happen at that warehouse. Are they engaging with other individuals that aren't receiving services as part of that warehouse? Are they working alongside somebody that's not receiving services? Or are they, in a room just working with other individuals receiving services and they don't have any opportunity to engage or interact with people other than the other individuals that are in that setting being supported? Anything you want to add? Okay. I know a lot of settings, especially if you're residential settings or even day programs, you might have an activity calendar. And while the presence of an activity calendar doesn't always indicate that individuals are getting out in the community, it can. Look at what those activities are and how does individual input go into that calendar. Also look at what the setting is doing if an individual doesn't want to participate in a particular activity. Are groups of individuals forced to go to the same activity in the same calendar, same day, same time, et cetera, or are there a lot of individual choices and flexibility in what that day-to-day looks like? Really look at choice as a whole, not a menu of choices. So if you can either pick A or B, that's not informed choice, and that's not really facilitating a lot for what an individual may want their day-to-day to look like. So make sure that as you're speaking with individuals and their families, if you're hearing a lot of, well, I can do this activity in the community or I have to stay home, what other choices are there? What does that individual want to do on a daily basis? And understand, what the program can and cannot support, but collect all of that information as you're going through each of these questions. The same thing in particular for those work programs. What type of paid employment opportunities do they have? Are they able to seek competitive integrated employment, so working alongside other individuals in the community that aren't receiving services? What do those opportunities look like? And ensuring that they're not just being isolated into a back room in a warehouse somewhere and not able to ever interact or engage with other individuals that aren't receiving services. That may sound like kind of a drastic example. Unfortunately, we've seen it. More sub-questions to access to the community. Choice to receive related personal services in the community rather than on-site. Some residential settings are, you might have therapies provided on-site. You might even have a beauty shop or other types of personal services that can be performed on-site. The presence of those things on-site themselves are not problematic. It's when individuals don't have a choice to engage in those same types of services in the community. So if you're a residential setting that has a beauty shop on site and that's where somebody wants to go, great. If they have their own salon that they want to go to in the community, but you're telling them no and we're not supporting that or facilitating that, that's when you're not going to completely be in alignment with what the purpose of some of these questions are. Taking a look at transportation options. So if you as a provider yourself doesn't provide transportation, what are the other public transportation options? Is Uber or Lyft available in the area? What is being done to help individuals and support them in accessing that transportation? And understanding that if they, based on whatever their needs are, can't access transportation safely by themselves, then is that assessed? Is that documented as part of their support plan? And what types, again, of ongoing education and training is being provided to that individual that maybe they can work up to some sort of level of support to where they can access transportation themselves. The other thing to start to think about here, especially if you don't have your own transportation as a provider, what are community resources you have? I know we've been to settings where you have individuals that want to go to certain churches, and so that setting will connect an individual to either the church service, or the transportation service that that church provides, or other individuals that aren't receiving services that attend that church that say, hey, I'll come by on Sunday and, I'll pick up Amanda and I'll take her to church. Use what's in your community. I know a lot of you are in very supportive communities that you have connections to local businesses and religious services. Just start evaluating what's already there, and those are the types of connections that you don't already have, you can start to make to help support and facilitate individuals in a more individualistic way, rather than just saying, well, we don't have transportation ourselves, so this just isn't an option. Option to control personal resources, if applicable. I know this is another one of those touch points where, in particular, if you have a conservator, oftentimes you see a family making these decisions for individuals. We've seen settings, some residential ones in particular, that make these choices and have this control for individuals, and don't offer them a lot of choice or flexibility in that process. So really speak to individuals and their families about this in particular, and what's being done to support individuals as part of money management. How is money management documented in their individual plan? What types of education and supports being provided to that individual if they do have a restriction or a modification in place that says they can't manage their own money. Make sure that if there's not an assessed need as a setting, that you're not just controlling all of that for an individual. That the individual's not having to ask a staff member for $5 if they, want to get something at the grocery store, or they want to go down the street. If they have that flexibility, and they don't have a modification in place that says they can't manage their own money, make sure they have that flexibility and freedom to do so. But again, even if it's a documented modification, there should still be ongoing education working with that individual so they understand why that restriction's in place and help work them toward maybe being able to manage their own money or some of their resources themselves.
Back on number 5, on transportation,
Mm-hmm.
and giving individuals an opportunity to be more individualized. In a work program, which we look at, asking them, well, how would you like to get to your job or to your food site? Even though we have the transportation, the regional pays for that, but we are, is that what we are looking for? Asking them, hey, do you want to continue to go on this type of transportation, or would you like to do another type of transportation being more individual? Is that what you're looking for there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an example. It's really, if you have that transportation and it's provided, there is nothing wrong with individuals utilizing that transportation. And I would assume that's probably their choice. That's definitely a convenience for them. But yeah, if you have individuals that are independent enough that maybe they drive themselves, maybe they want to drive to the setting and meet you there. I don't know if the department would have any issues with that. Definitely consult your regional center. But again, it's really about that individual choice and making sure that they have those choices and those opportunities. Unless they have some sort of documented restriction or modification in place that says that based on whatever their needs are, they can't complete that safely. The last thing I want to touch on really quick about the money management is, I know most individuals have a budget. Are they involved in that budgeting process? So again, making sure that a family member that's not a guardian or not a conservator is not saying, well, they can only have $20 this week, make sure you don't give them more. All about the individual and what their needs and their choices should be. So at the end of each federal requirement, you'll see in kind of an all-encompassing question that says, okay, based on all of these responses, where do you feel like you are in terms of aligning with this criteria? So met, partially met, make sure that you're explaining and supporting what your response is. This is where you're looking for that documentation. You're looking for what input you've received from individuals, their families. If you are a provider that happens to have like an advisory board or something like that, feel free to consult them as well. But all of that information that you've taken a look at collectively, explain why basically you're selecting the response that you're selecting. Especially in particular if you indicated partially met or not met, list those reasons you think you don't meet that criteria. Because all of that is going to better help your regional center support you in developing that plan, that remediation plan for coming into alignment with whatever that requirement is. Yes.
On F3, how are the care we own residential homes for children? So there are going to be questions that truly are not applicable because, say, a 2-year-old is not going to. So how do we answer that?
So the question was about if it is a setting that is supporting children, how would they respond to a question like FR3 about individuals seeking paid employment? Is this the question you mentioned earlier that actually has an NA option? So this question number 3 in particular should be, I believe, the only question now that you see in that portal that has a not applicable option. So you would indicate NA for 3, and then in that final response in that narrative, I would just explain that you answered NA because you only provide support to children. So none of them are actively seeking paid employment. So we'll go through federal requirement number 2. So again, you'll see this in the portal. This is just that overarching requirement as it's laid out in the final rule. This language comes directly from the final rule. And I think this is one of those that I touched on early on that you may feel like as a setting, you're not solely responsible for this. So this is about ensuring that an individual has an opportunity to select where they're receiving services. They're provided options that are not just specific to individuals with disabilities, that they are able to select from other settings that don't just support individuals with disabilities. If it's a residential setting, you know, were they given other options about apartments or homes or other places that they could lease from in the area that you or I may live in? Yes?
Once again, for children, once our children are placed by CPS, obviously they don't have an option, so how would we answer and choices if they don't have a choice?
So I know there's not an NA option for this. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add to that one.
Yeah, so the question was if, you know, for example, there's a residential setting for children who are placed there by CPS, Child Protective Services. Obviously, the child is not getting a choice in where they go in that moment. And so I think I would just I would just answer honestly and say no, that they didn't have a choice, and then explain that in your response as to why.
I think those sub-questions will help with that too, Jamie, if you don't mind flipping. Especially, you know, here with 1 and 2, what level of information is included in that child's plan. All of that should still be outlined in there. And then really in particular for number 2, and this is especially for individuals that are providers that are supporting individuals that are adults, if the answer to this is currently no, that's still okay. Again, as a reminder, you have plenty of time to help remediate that, understanding that this type of choice can occur at different levels. If you are a residential provider, the one thing I would think through though and how to address number 2 on an ongoing basis, while that initial selection of the setting may not have, you as a provider may not have had a role in that selection, how are you addressing it if once an individual is in your setting? They have chosen your program to receive services, and they start to vocalize, I don't want to receive services here anymore, or I don't want to live here anymore. What does that process look like, and what options are you providing them from that point on? So that's the lens that I would really focus on for number 2. So let's say you're a residential provider and the individual was only given your place and another residential provider to choose from where they only support individuals with disabilities. Understanding that that choice you didn't have a role in, but what's an individual's been in your setting, they're living in your setting, and they come to their direct support staff and say, I don't want to live here anymore. What is the process for connecting them to their regional center? Who do they speak to if they want to move? And what options are provided to them from that point?
This has to be on the ICC?
Yes, it should be documented in their plan. Yes.
So, to piggyback on what you're saying, if those special requirements are set up in their ICC based on their they're bound to be your home. So once they're in their home, and they're saying, well, I don't want to be here anymore, but they're still bound by that entity, they really don't have a choice.
Yeah, I think that is kind of a unique situation. So you're saying like they have a court order where they were specifically placed in that setting?
Yes.
Yeah, that is, again, should be part of their plan. But if they're expressing a desire to move from that setting, but they were placed there by something that's entirely out of your control, like a court order, I would just make sure that you're documenting their concerns and questions and, support provided on an ongoing basis in their plans. But it's not your choice at that point. But I would still contact your regional center and work with your regional center to make sure that you as a provider of those HCBS services are doing everything that you can to help support that individual. I think there's always what feel like some exceptions to this, especially those unique situations where court orders are court orders. I actually had a question from another state about difficulty getting informed consent. They're a setting that serves a high number of sex offenders, and they have a modification in place. The individual can't go, within a certain amount of feet from a park, and that individual's not, they were concerned that modification, they weren't going to gain informed consent from that individual, but there's a court order in place clearly because of other reasons. So there, things like that are out of the provider's control, the legal system has control over. Those are things that you can explain as part of your narrative, but just make sure you're very clear. And those should be very limited exceptions for few individuals. It's not like where that could become a problem is, well, you have one individual that you're supporting that has a court order in place, but we're going to put a restriction in place for everybody because of this one individual with a court order. Again, those are where you're going to have some areas where you do need to take another look at and remediate and make sure any of that is handled on an individual basis and not blanket restrictions because of just a few individuals you may support with those types of restrictions in place. So this section is a little bit shorter, so again, it's the same thing. It's just kind of that all-encompassing question on how you feel, where you currently stand in alignment with this requirement, making sure that you're documenting any type of support that you have for your response. And again, don't be afraid to indicate that, you've partially met it or you're just not quite there yet. All of that information is going to be useful to your regional center. The more information they have, the better they're going to be able to support you through the remediation process. It is extremely rare and can raise a little bit more flags if you see a self-assessment or any type of assessment that says, oh yeah, we're 100% compliant, we are good to go. So keep in mind that that's not looked at negatively. The regional center is not going to take that self-assessment and say, oh, you weren't compliant in these 4 areas, we're just not going to work with you anymore. That is not the goal or purpose of part of this process at all.
So we have to explain how we missed. Yes.
Yep. All of that information, again, helps them make that initial determination of compliance. And if you are selected for an on-site assessment, as part of that random sample, the more information they have, the better they're going to be able to validate all of that information. Even if you aren't selected for an on-site, there's still a level of validation that will need to occur post-self-assessment. So again, the state will be working with the regional center. It could be taking, the regional center taking a look at what your policies and procedures are. Obviously, your regional centers are very familiar with the settings in their area and how they operate. So they'll be looking for all of this information on your self-assessment, and they'll be able to guide you and direct you through that. Criteria 3, so the setting or service ensures an individual's rights to privacy, dignity, respect, and freedom from coercion and restraint. So you'll see all of your sub-questions again, making sure that individuals are just informed of their rights. They understand what those rights are, and any modifications to their privacy, any modifications or the use of restraint is well documented in their individual plan and meets all of those criteria for modification that were outlined previously. Making sure that your policies and procedures match this, but also your practices. So if an individual has visitors in your setting, but you tell them they can only meet whoever their visitor is in this one particular area, and that's a common area, and they can't ever have privacy with those visitors, look for those things. speak to individuals about that. And even if you say, well, you can meet with visitors wherever, if you're speaking to individuals and they say, well, I don't feel like I have privacy because my sister comes to visit me and I always have a staff member that just kind of stands over me or stands around me or watches or listens to what our conversations are, or, you know, I ask to use the phone in the office, but I'm not allowed to use the phone privately. I can't go get my own mail. You know, those types of things, those are the types of questions that you can ask of individuals to make sure that they, while you think your policies and practices support that, what's actually happening on a day-to-day basis, and do individuals feel like they have those rights and those rights are honored. Provider communications in particular, we usually take this one step further on on-site assessments with things like medication management. If you're a residential setting and everybody's medicine is laid out on the kitchen counter and medicine is administered during dinner time and everybody just stands in a line and the provider hands out their medicine, that's not really honoring an individual's privacy. So making sure just, you know, it's the telephone conversations, it's the visitors, it's those things, but think about other practices that you have in place where an individual's medical information or personal information could be compromised at your setting. If you have individuals with dietary restrictions or therapy schedules, make sure those aren't posted to where everybody can see those. We've been to settings where you'll see right on the refrigerator, Amanda has a restriction to dairy, so-and-so has this dietary restriction. Make sure those are not accessible to just anybody in that setting. There are definitely ways where that information can be documented and kept confidential on an individual basis where only the staff that should have access to that information has that access. You don't have to flip back, but the other point I would add about an individual's rights, I know sometimes they're posted openly in a setting, and that's great, but make sure as a provider you're actually working with individuals so they understand what those rights are. Don't just think a poster in a setting ensures that an individual really knows what their rights and understand what those rights are. So make sure that there's some type of engagement with individuals and their families so that they're not just reading those rights, but they really understand what they mean and what they mean to them as an individual. Yeah, and I mean, that should really be done on an ongoing basis as well. It's just that touch point with individuals so they know what their rights are in your setting. Yeah, so if you, to your point, if you do that with your staff, make sure your staff are also subsequently doing that on an ongoing basis. You know, we have found sometimes that staff are not always carrying out policies and procedures as intended on a daily basis. Some additional questions, again, individuals having privacy while they use the restroom and assisted with personal care. Can individuals go in the bathroom and shut the door? You know, do they always have a staff member that accompanies them? If that's not a documented restriction or modification that they need that additional level of support, then they should be able to use the restroom, you know, independently. In the cases, if you're a residential provider and they share bedrooms, if personal care is provided into that individual's room, what types of practices are in place to ensure if the individual says, hey, I don't want my roommate in here while you're doing that, you know, use of privacy curtains or, you know, what's being done to make sure that that individual's choice is being honored. Communicating with individuals based on their needs and preferences. Again, if you have individuals that are nonverbal or maybe don't, you know, if English isn't their primary language, make sure that you have the right supports in place to where that individual can be heard and communicated with. Again, even if they're nonverbal, they have nonverbal cues. There are ways to communicate with every individual and their family. So make sure you're working with them, collecting information from them, and, you know, working with your direct support staff and understanding what those cues and that type of communication looks like. You never want to have an individual in your setting that doesn't feel like nobody can communicate with them in any way. Allowing individuals to dress or groom in a manner that's appropriate to the setting while honoring individual choice and lifestyle preferences. This may sound relatively straightforward, but we have been in settings where an individual's choice in the clothing they wear isn't always honored. understanding that, you know, there is a level of appropriateness that comes along with this. But it could be that an individual wants to wear their pajamas in the living room. Just think of it as, you know, how you would handle your home and the choices that you have, and that individuals have opportunities for those same types of choices. I touched on this one a little bit, if individuals are able to visit with others in private. Again, even if you say, you know, your setting has a policy where none of that's restricted, that's why it's important to speak to individuals directly and make sure that they feel like they have that choice, they feel like they have that privacy. Because even if your setting has the best intention or your staff has the best intention, sometimes individuals may not always feel like that level of privacy is honored. Does the setting ensure the staff knowledgeable about capabilities, preferences, interests, and needs of the individuals they serve? So what is your staff doing on an ongoing basis to make sure that they understand an individual's needs? Do they have access to that individual support plan? Are they reviewing it? And as part of that planning process, the individual's goals, interests, daily choices, not just medical or clinical needs, are documented in there, but they're really looking at that individual as a whole and what they would like their day-to-day to look like. How is staff trained and knowledgeable on that? And what are you as a provider doing to ensure that that's happening? A place for individuals to store belongings in a secure manner. So again, this, if staff holds any valuables for individuals, or they say, oh, we'll hold on to this for you, that's not really allowing that individual to have a choice to secure their own belongings. If you are a residential setting and they're in a bedroom and you say, well, they can keep everything in their bedroom, but their bedroom door doesn't lock and there's no other method in that bedroom for them to secure anything that's valuable to them, that's not really a completely sufficient response. So again, just evaluating that, talking to individuals, seeing what they think their options are, and how they secure anything that is important to them. Telling their family member that they can't have anything valuable at the setting and they have to keep it home isn't a solution to that question either. A lot of sub-questions on this one. Again, individuals have the ability to talk on the phone, text, read, email, etc. in private. Are there any restrictions on access within the service location? So, for example, are there certain areas that individuals cannot access? They're not allowed to go outside of the fence in the backyard. Again, if there is not a documented modification in place that meets all of those criteria, those are the types of questions you should be asking yourself and asking of individuals. It's the same thing for all of these questions, but I can't stress the importance of talking to individuals any more heavily and just weighing what they're telling you, because even if you think your setting is doing all of the right things and you don't have any restrictive policies or procedures in place, that doesn't mean that maybe there aren't some direct support staff that individuals don't feel like or really aren't getting these opportunities on a day-to-day basis. So even if your documentation and all of that matches that, make sure you're speaking with those individuals and that they know that they have these rights and these opportunities, and you're really looking at whether those are being met or not. If you utilize restraints, so any use of restraints should be documented in the individual's plan. Very clear on, again, that ongoing data. Any type of restraint should not be permanent. If there are PRN medications that are used to control behaviors, that's the type of, that is still a type of restraint. It's just a chemical restraint and not a physical restraint. So those are the types of questions you should be asking of your setting, asking of individuals in particular, and really weighing like what your direct support staff say. If you have individuals that exhibit certain behaviors, what type of education and support is being provided to that individual, and not just given some form of a medication, et cetera, to manage or control that. The use of delayed egress devices or secured perimeters. I know some settings have this in place. Again, answer this question honestly. Include all of your information in your narrative that supports. If you use any of these devices or you have these secured perimeters, make sure you explain them very clearly. That can include cameras outside of the setting, inside of the setting, explain where they are, why they're located there, and what their function is. If you're using delayed egress devices, are those done on an individual basis, or is that done like every door is secured and locked and alarmed, et cetera? Make sure you're going to that level of detail in your explanation with this question. Okay.
Is there any door that has a lock or that they don't have access to, or?
Yeah, so the question is about secured perimeters and any door that may have a lock. Yes, if it is a door that is alarmed or secured during the day, during the night, et cetera, if there are locked, secured gates that can monitor entry in or out of the setting, those are the types of things that should be documented.
You said cameras. If you have cameras, why would that be like that? I don't see where that's,
So for 13 in particular, the use of cameras can really speak to how you're securing the perimeters. If you have cameras on the outside of your setting that are for safety reasons because of the neighborhood, et cetera, other homes in the neighborhood that are residential in nature that individuals not receiving services live in, the presence alone of cameras isn't necessarily indicative of a problem. We have seen cameras that are utilized inside of a setting that are used to monitor or restrict individual movement. So that's the level of information that we're looking for. And again, even if it's located outside of the building, why is that camera in place? Is it making sure that individuals aren't leaving the setting without, staff monitoring them, et cetera? So just make sure you're, at this point, just explaining the use of them, where they are located at the setting, and then you can work with your regional centers specifically for them to give you a little bit more clear guidance as to whether they feel that meets the purpose of being a home and community-based setting or not.
Because if you have a door that's locked to keep people from the street, you still have to keep our front door locked. Because people that are inside can go out as freely as they want, but it's to protect the public from coming in unannounced. So is that what you're asking us to explain?
Yeah, I would explain that. And then also, what if a visitor comes to the setting? So, if Amanda's mom shows up and wants to visit, what are their options for accessing that setting? Can an individual open the door and let their family member in, et cetera? So those are all kind of the other questions, the follow-up questions to ask about the purpose of that and its function, and just making sure that it's not used as a restrictive measure to make sure individuals can't come and go or receive visitors, et cetera.
I guess because we don't have any residential holiday programs, so I'm trying to, work programs, so I'm trying to wrap my mind around this, because a lot of it seem like it's for residential, people in the room or whatever.
Yeah, so these criteria in particular still do apply to non-residential settings. So even if the front door is locked on your day program, can individuals that you're providing support to with that day program, can they use that door? If it's locked, do they need a staff member that helps them unlock that door? So that's the type of, again, being locked in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem, but it's the function, and if individuals can use that door without support from a staff member. All right, I think we've covered these. Same thing here with that all-encompassing question. The other thing that I should have said up front, but I do want to be clear about too, there's not a right or wrong answer. This is just a way to evaluate where you currently are in terms of aligning with the final rule. So you should be answering it with all of the information that you have in your hands. Again, those policies and procedures, but way more heavily what individuals and their families are experiencing, and making sure all of that is going into providing your response. And your regional center will continue to work with you and make sure that you're addressing all of those areas. I don't know if you want to take a break, Susie, and keep going.
Yeah, if people are feeling now might be a good time, a 5 or 10 minute break, if people are information dense, so.
For those in the live stream, we're just going to mute for now, and then when we get started, we will unmute so that you don't have to listen to all the background noise. Thanks. Hi, everyone. For those in the WebEx, we're going to get started in 1 more minute. Thanks for your patience.
We're going to go ahead and get started again in like 30 seconds. So everybody could find their seat, please. All right, we're going to go ahead and pick up where we left off with requirement number 4. So this just kind of goes back to the level of autonomy and independence that individuals have as part of the services that they're receiving. Again, you're going to see that overarching federal requirement, and then your questions, you're going to have the sub-questions specifically kind of speak to ensuring that they do have a certain level of autonomy and independence based on what their level of need is. So some of those questions, we've talked about a little bit, but what are their input and choices into their daily activities? Again, if you have an activity calendar in place, how is that put together? What input is received from individuals? What types of choices do they have in that process? Do they have the ability to control their own schedules? Does everybody always have to go to, as a group, at the specified times as part of that calendar or that schedule of activities? And again, make sure you're really looking at meaningful choice, and then it's just not a menu of one or two options that you can go here, you can stay here, or those are your only choices on a day-to-day basis. Consulting back to that individual's plan. What are their goals? What types of activities do they want to be engaging in? And really understanding how you can facilitate that on a daily basis. How are you structuring your support so that individuals can interact with other individuals that they choose, both at their home or their day program or whatever that setting is, and making sure, again, those interactions are meaningful and with people that just aren't paid to support them or volunteering to provide support to them. Really take a look at what those interactions are. We've done on-site assessments in other places where some of the staff have said, well, we take them in the community and they get to wave at the people that live there. That's not a meaningful interaction. You laugh, but this has honestly been told, not in California, but this has been told to us by other providers. So really talk to your individuals, ask them what those interactions are. What are their interactions? And, you know, are there more interactions that they would like to see take place? Yes.
Do individuals have the ability to control their own schedule? Work setting, they don't have the ability to control what their work schedule. So we would just write that down. These are the hours that our employer wants them to be there, and this is what the hours are. Now, they can choose to accept the job or not accept the job.
Right. Yes. From a work perspective, so the question was about individuals controlling their own schedules, and if it is a work program specifically, that's an understandable, I don't even want to say restriction. You know, we all have work hours. We all have jobs that we have to report to from certain time periods. So making sure that's documented. And again, as part of the selection of that job, that should be documented in that individual's plan, that they had a clear understanding of what those hours were and what those expectations are. You know, do they have break times, lunch times, et cetera, like other people that are working in that setting? You know, looking to that level of detail with their schedule. But no, if they're selecting a job where they're required to work from 10 to 2, just explain that as part of your narrative as to, you know, that's a part of their schedule that they do not have control over, arguably. So I'll defer to Susie as to what level of information they expect to be in a plan in terms of work program.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that if you're, you know, as a work activity program or a support employment program, if you have a set schedule based on the hours that we work, just like any of us do when we, you know, have a set schedule at work, then I would say that you would need that this question is met because you're not imposing restrictions to their schedule outside of that. Now, if, you know, during the day, you know, and I don't know if you feel differently from that, but if there's something that you're doing in the way you provide services to make it so that they don't have options, as Amanda was saying, you know, in terms of, well, if I want to work at night, is there a job that is available that, you know, you could help them search for, or do they have the opportunity to do that? For that reason.
The other thing that I would add with those community interactions and opportunities is making sure that they're not limited or just specifically designed for individuals with disabilities. You know, if individuals attend a movie in the community, is it a movie that anybody else in that community can go attend, or is it a set movie time in a set location that only individuals receiving services can attend? So make sure that, you know, again, those interactions are with the broader community and not just specifically designed for individuals that are receiving services.
If I can clarify really quick too, I just want to say, you know, you're answering these questions as somebody who provides the services, you know, that your vendor to provide. So you're This question of do individuals have the ability to control their own schedules, I'm looking at that differently as a residential provider than I am an employment service, and so keeping that in mind too.
Other questions about, individuals engaging in activities that interest them. Again, really knowing what those interests are, speaking with individuals, finding it out from their perspective and not just what, staff may dictate as their interests. And understanding, just like you or I, those interests can change. Just because somebody likes to do puzzles doesn't mean that that's the only thing that they want to do all day long, every single day of their life. So ongoing conversation, listening to that individual, speaking to that individual, and really getting from their perspective what those choices and types of activities that they want to engage in. Can they spend time including dining alone or in a private area? If you are a setting that, has meal times or those meal times set and individuals only sit at the table, are there assigned seats at that table so they have to sit by the same people every single day? Do they have opportunities? If you have an outdoor patio area, can they go out on the patio area and have their lunch, et cetera? Thinking through all of those things. And again, when you're speaking to individuals, do they feel like they have those opportunities, or do staff discourage those practices? We have definitely, seen and heard that from individuals across the board. While, you as a provider may not have any intent or have a policy in place that says individuals can't, eat alone or eat by themselves, that doesn't mean that, unfortunately, you may not have some staff that might be discouraging those practices because it might not be the most convenient choice for your staff. So again, can't highlight the importance enough of speaking to individuals and making sure they really understand what those opportunities and choices are. Same thing with their autonomy to make personal decisions, such as practice religion or voting. If you have individuals that, want to attend a specific church service or other religious service or anything like that in the community, what are you doing? What is your staff doing to help facilitate and support those decisions? And not making those choices for individuals or on their behalf. Same example I gave earlier, if you have individuals that want to attend a different church services, what types of community resources are in place or connections can you make to help you as a provider facilitate those choices? So, you may not have the transportation means to transport 8 different individuals to 8 different services at the same time. But again, make those connections and see what resources are already there that you can build upon. And again, with all of them, the overarching question, how you feel that you're meeting compliance overall with that specific criteria, and documenting any of that information here. I would like to add on break, I got a really good question, an example that I want to point out. The question was asked about in some of the settings where there are not lockable bedroom doors because of a local or fire ordinance in place. And so if the setting had locked doors in certain areas, that they would be in violation of that local code and obviously be fined for it. That's the type of information that I would make sure you're documenting clearly as part of your response and connecting with your regional center on. I have heard this from other areas. We did do some residential assessment for California's DHCS program. And heard a lot of this with their assisted living facilities in particular, that there are some areas in California that have ordinances in place that kind of dictate which doors can be locked, et cetera. So at this point, again, just make sure you're documenting that, explaining that in your response, and then your regional center will work directly with DDS to help resolve and discuss how they're going to approach those issues. Federal Requirement 5, choice of services and support. So again, how is your setting facilitating individual choice regarding services and supports, and who provides those? A lot of these questions are, again, centered around the individual's choice. So making sure that you're speaking with them about what those choices are, and how many opportunities they feel like they have, or how much flexibility they have to make those choices. Which staff to provide their care, if they have gender preferences, or they maybe English isn't their primary language. Do they have staff that can actually communicate with them? again, understanding, like, I feel like sometimes this is dismissed often by your direct support staff when they're working with individuals as, you know, well, so-and-so just likes to complain about me, they just don't like me, et cetera. So if you're hearing that frequently, or you have support staff that are saying that frequently, talk to that individual specifically, try to figure out why they're complaining, what types of issues they're having, and what's the process in place if they do have a staff member that they have ongoing issues or concerns with, because that can definitely have a day-to-day impact on that individual's experience at that setting and what they really feel like their choices are. You definitely don't want to have any individuals that are in fear of speaking up or things like that. But much more mildly on a day-to-day basis, understanding that there can easily be cultural preferences as to why an individual may choose a male or female staff member to only provide support to them. So what, to the extent possible, is your setting doing to make sure that those choices are reflected in their plan and accommodated? Do you have a complaint or grievance policy in place? And again, how are individuals informed of that process and understand that process? It's much like the example of an individual rights poster being in the setting. You know, it's more than just a document. It's more than just having, you know, handing a document to somebody and say, hey, read this when you get a chance. Making sure that they really understand what that process is. They know how to file a grievance. They know who to speak to. And that's your information that should be coming from individuals directly and not just your staff saying, oh, well, yeah, we've told them. Of course they know. Having opportunities to modify their services or schedules, voice their concerns. Again, all of this is just kind of in the same context as making sure that, you know, not only there's a process in place for individuals to speak up and request changes, but they know what that process looks like and they feel comfortable speaking up with their staff and raising some of these questions or concerns. For your work programs in particular, individuals of a retirement age, are they offered a choice to retire from a day program or a work program? And again, do they understand that they have that choice, or do they feel like they have to go to work if they're retirement age, et cetera? Types of questions that you can easily work with individuals and get their feedback on. Slide was a pretty short one. So again, you're going to see your all-encompassing question of where you feel like you currently are in terms of your level of compliance, and any sort of, you know, if you're not quite there yet, feel free to explain why and lay all of that information out for your regional center so they can better help you through this process. So the next set of questions are those that are specific to provider owner-controlled residential settings. Again, if you're just a day program provider, work program provider, you don't provide these types of residential services, you're not even going to see these questions. So you don't have to worry about selecting NA or anything like that. So we'll go ahead and walk through these. The first one is specific to having a residential agreement in place. This is just like anybody else that would be renting a home, et cetera, in the community that isn't receiving services. So do they have a lease in place? Does it have the same protections and rights regarding eviction and what that process looks like? Are individuals properly informed, et cetera? If they want to relocate or request new housing, what does that process look like? Are individuals informed of that process? Again, a lease is more than just providing an individual with a document and telling them to sign that. Making sure that your setting is working with those individuals specifically to understand what's contained in that document and what their rights are in terms of their lease and protections from eviction. Yes.
Had some conversations with our regional center about this, we're still sort of unclear about for residential programs, and so there's like a program design and an extra criteria, how that sort of coalesce with a lease agreement and eviction.
Can you repeat that again?
So yeah, there's a program design around like the level of care and the service, and there's like exit and just an exit criteria that sort of relates to a person if they're well supported in a setting. Regulations. So we haven't gotten very clear information about sort of how that sort of coalesces with the idea of a lease agreement and eviction rights. And we wrote an admissions agreement. We wrote an admissions agreement that we think sort of covers the information that's in HCBS rules.
Yep.
But we don't have anything in there about eviction rights because that's not really in a licensed, like on-level setting. It may not, it doesn't really apply.
or we don't understand, and I don't think our regional player yet understands, we're just trying to work together on it, but maybe some insight.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I should clarify too, the words like lease or residency agreement are used pretty consistently, and I know it's the terminology in the rule, but it's really a document that functions in the same way. So, you know, each setting may call it differently. You know, at this point, California doesn't dictate to you specifically what it needs to be called. And so the process for moving that from that setting or leaving that setting may not be titled eviction, so to speak, but that same level of information should be contained therein. So like the 30-day notice, for example, that you gave, that would be valid and good information to have in that type of agreement. And the key, again, is to make sure the individual understands it, understands what their rights are under that document, and any circumstance in which they could be asked to maybe leave that setting, what that notice looks like, their appeal rights, et cetera. And I imagine, I don't want to speak for DDS, but I think that's an area too where regional centers will continue to work with DDS and filter some additional information and technical assistance as part of that process. So the more information and narrative you provide in your response here, the better they're going to be able to do that. Yep. And I think that kind of addressed the third question in this area too. Again, what are the policies and procedures look like in place to make sure individuals are informed of whatever their rights are under that agreement, and their protections from just being evicted or asked to leave, et cetera. This one is very straightforward, very short and straightforward, so you'll see that all-encompassing question again there, and this is a really good place to highlight, you know, there are certain pieces of your agreement, whatever it's called, residency agreement, lease, et cetera, that you want to paste in here. This would be a good opportunity to do so. Again, don't provide the whole document, don't copy and paste in your entire document, but just kind of narratively explain what you have in place and how you feel it meets or does not meet this specific area. Rights to privacy, so we've covered this a little bit more in terms of how it would apply across the board, whether you're a day program or a residency program. But for residential programs in particular, how this applies to privacy in an individual's sleeping or living unit. So those lockable entrance doors with only appropriate staff having keys. If it's a home, the individuals have a key to the home. If they don't, because it's a modification that individual maybe can't, for whatever need, can't have a key to the home, make sure that's documented and you're following that modifications process. Same thing with locks to their bedroom doors. Making sure that all of that information is outlined, and there's some level of key assessment done before you just say an individual can't have access to the home or have a key to their bedroom. All of that information should be contained in their plan, especially when you're removing that ability to have some type of key or access to their sleeping or living unit. Having, in the instance where there are shared units, individuals having a choice in who their roommates are in that setting, and that you have a process in place for if there are disagreements between roommates, how is that managed? I would really speak to individuals about this specifically. Do they know who to talk to if they're having disagreements with their roommate? Who are they speaking to in that setting, and how is that staff person from there taking that concern and helping support that individual? Fully understanding in the context of all of this, there are so many rooms and only, so many options within a setting, but that doesn't negate the need for some type of process to be in place to help individuals work through these issues and accommodate them to the extent possible. So these are a lot of the subsequent questions you're going to see related to that. If it's private accommodations, then obviously you can just mark that they're all private rooms. Yes.
So how do you address the right of privacy in individual bedrooms that they still have the right to deny access for unannounced visits? So we, in our facility, we get community for licensing in the regional center. So the three things that we do, they're unannounced, and individuals who live in our home have no choice as to whether their bedroom's going to be accessed in the home.
So I'll defer to see, because that's more of a licensing evaluation question.
The regional center, so 3 times a year that they're denied that, yes, their non-disabled neighbors or peers or classmates still count that as things.
Yeah, I think I understand your question, but to repeat it, the question was just that, you know, for unannounced visits, I know many of you who are residential providers are very accustomed to those, either from licensing, CCL, from the regional center, whoever that may be, but that entity. But I would think that this question, it's more applicable to the day-to-day life of that person. And I think that if, you know, if that individual during an unannounced visit, you know, is refusing that, you know, no, I want my privacy, I think that, you know, that can also be documented and something that can be respected. If not, yeah.
And they come in and they pull back the sheet, he freaks out. Did you know they wash their hands? If they wash their hands, and then we'll wash the sheet. But just an invasion of his personal space, he is making that criminals have more rights. Because the police can't come in and search without a warrant. Why can these strangers come into my bedroom and open my closet door, open my...
Yeah. You know, and I'm
Question that I think I will pick out here. So you're saying that this should be documented, you're saying that it's not respected either way. I'm wondering what CDS thinks about this. Maybe this question could be taken back to them, because I know during FHA reviews, and this comes up a lot, and they cite regulation constantly. It's a question I've had as well. If it's an IDP, if it's being documented, if the person does not want anybody touching their things or going into their room, will that be respected? I think the other thing.
yeah, did you?
Yeah, I was going to say, so I think I want to make sure that we are differentiating that circumstance between, as Susie mentioned, in the context of the self-assessment, what are those rights on an just a daily basis? If you are having licensing, you know, that not being respected by those types of visits, make sure you're communicating that back to the regional center, who will in turn work with DDS, because I think that's a different context than what we're speaking to in answering this question.
But it doesn't affect their daily life, because daily there's going to be, oh my goodness, I have to have my bed made. Because they can come in any day. And so what if my bed is just made? And I have CCL happen. Why isn't your bed made? And they turn to me and say, why isn't his bed made? And I said, he's 16. On my room where I did, my bed wasn't made. But it is a quality of life. I can tell you I've done this for 31 years. It's a quality of life issue. It is.
And these visits from CCL and the regional center, they are constant. You know, they happen frequently. So I didn't think it was actually daily. There's something that comes up frequently.
It is. I left it, and so the regional center took one of my kids left a bar soda in the bathroom.
Yeah, I mean,
And I'm thinking, how is that being treated? It's institutionalized treatment. It's not being treated as their neighbor or their peers in their class. It's okay if they leave a bar soda out, but not in my home. At least me, it impacts the day-to-day.
Yeah, so just to repeat for those on participating on the phone, I think the concerns that have been brought up are about these sort of visits and the potential for these visits to happen at any given moment, and kind of mitigating those fears with consumers who live their day-to-day life in that sort of headspace. And so I think the answer to that is that there's room for, I think, for some guidance on that, and room for further exploration into how to manage that within these roles. You know, I think as Amanda has expressed throughout, we have years, you know, we have some time to come into, to bring our services into alignment with these roles and really understand what that means for each service and for each individual. And so looking at that on an individualized basis, I think that that's part of what the self-assessment is going to do. And so answering it the best you can, and know that there is no right or wrong answer for each question that you have. So I can just write it.
So honestly, like for your example, keep in mind that you're responding to this through your lens as a provider. You should be collecting feedback from individuals and their families and that documentation, but that's not a practice that you are restricting. You know, you are not telling individuals, you have to put this bar of soap up. You cannot have this level of privacy. You as a provider are not doing that, because that's the way that you should be answering these questions. And those concerns should absolutely still be relayed to your regional center and to DDS, but separately and outside of this self-assessment process. You shouldn't have to say, no, I'm not compliant here because I feel like licensing is going to come in and not allow this level of autonomy or independence for individuals. But yeah, I would highly encourage having those conversations with your regional center and see how that's being fed back to DDS and what's being done from a licensing perspective.
So if there is an issue of an item that a client wants to have out and accessible to them, but licensing rules contradict that ability, do we have to write all those types of, the client has requested that is whatever the accessible, but regulations state that it needs to be locked status, and we have to write all those things on the IPP if the client has brought it to us as a problem?
I mean, I would give examples for sure because, you know, like, but as part of the statewide transition plan, DDS was tasked with taking a look at their own policies and procedures and regulations to see and identify any area where that might conflict with coming into alignment with the final rule. But, you know, that level of nuance, I'm not sure how well that's communicated back. I would, you know, I don't think you have to list out if there's 42 different examples that you can give. You know, I don't think you have to go to that level of detail. But any area that you don't feel like you can come into compliance with or aren't currently because of some sort of regulation or licensing practice that's in place, absolutely make sure you're identifying that. Yep. Okay. I think we can go, I think we've addressed these. Same thing with privacy, that all-encompassing question. Again, this would be a really good place to document some of those examples, and anytime that you don't feel like you can be in compliance or are in compliance with a certain area, make sure you're relaying that. This is your opportunity to do so. And again, you know, as we've stressed, there's not a right or wrong answer. And the more information you're funneling back to your regional center as part of this process that's being funneled back to DDS, the better supported you're going to be through this remediation process, and, you know, allowing the regional center and DDS to maybe identify any other of their own practices or policies that need to address to help you come into alignment. Individuals have freedom and support to control own schedules, activities, and access to food at any time. Again, the overarching federal requirement around individual choices. Make sure with these subsequent sections, as with all of the other areas, that you're talking to individuals about each one of these areas. Again, you may not feel like as a provider you have any restrictions in place or any practices that would prohibit an individual from feeling like they have these choices or access, but it's best to hear that from the individuals themselves. Can you do mine? Access to food is one we hear about a lot. Allergies, you know, medical conditions, anything like that that may require restrictions. Any of those modifications should be documented on an individual basis. If you have an individual that you serve that's diabetic, what level of support is being provided to them? How are they being educated about their food choices? You can't just lock a refrigerator up and not allow anybody access to it because you might be supporting somebody that maybe doesn't always make the best choices for themselves, but it should be, you know, as a provider, making sure that you're working, again, with them specifically on what those choices and practices need to be. It's the same thing with, you know, meal times, break times, et cetera. If an individual wants a snack, do they have an opportunity to have that level of access at any time? Or again, you know, maybe you have direct support staff in your settings that are discouraging some of that access. Make sure that you're, you know, identifying those areas and working with your staff too to train them and work through that so they have the tools that they need to be able to support individuals that may not be making, you know, the most appropriate food choices. Question.
So, totally understand about the needs, but if a home is specialized, it's based around like a home, to where those specifics are there. It's in a program design, it's in an IPT, and you can only provide choices, but those choices are based on whatever their calorie count is, et cetera. So this is just where I'm identifying or detailing that in it, or just?
Yep, include that level of information. As you mentioned, you said it yourself. It may be a home that specializes in individuals that are specifically diagnosed with Prader-Willi, but all of them have that level of information in their individual support plan. Make sure you're documenting that. Make sure you're clear there that, yes, we have restrictions on food. They may appear as blanket restrictions, but if every single one of those individuals has been assessed, those modifications are documented, and you follow that modification process for each individual, then you should be able to mark that, you know, you've met that criteria. But I would make sure you're specifically detailing that level of specialization, and that despite serving only individuals that may have that diagnosis, you're still documenting those needs or restrictions on an individual basis. That's another question.
It's hard not to like feel like I'm trying to split hairs. So in a children's facility, so from my perspective, one of my jobs as a provider to a child is to teach them, right? Help them, like I was my own child, teach them, you know, appropriate, not appropriate.
Right.
So in my own house with my own kids, I'm not gonna give my kids dinner and then let them get up in the middle of the night and eat every single night whenever they want to.
Right.
To me, that's not, you know, so where does that prudent parenting? So we're taking CPS place children to home, right? And where does that fall in all of this? I mean, is that something that we should be writing up in our thing, that because we're providing care to children, we're trying to teach them appropriate eating habits, therefore we are not going to, or do we just let them do whatever they want? To me, that is not, that's not the right thing.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely not the intent. But I think, again, you highlighted the examples yourself about the level of education that you're providing, and how individuals are being, you know, children in particular, being educated on what those choices are. It shouldn't just be looked at as a free-for-all either. Like, individuals could just run in and outside of the setting and eat whatever they want and do whatever they want. You know, there's still a level of responsibility and support that needs to be provided, whether they are children or adults. And I imagine that education is documented in their plan. So that's the type of practices that you want to highlight as part of that process. That, well, yeah, but a kid, I'm not going to let, you know, Joey get up at midnight and eat a full meal at midnight every single night. But, you know, if you have a type of continued behavior, consistent behavior, ongoing, where the same requests are being made, what level of education and support are you providing that child to help mitigate some of that, and understanding the solution is not just handing them food every time that they request.
So say that it's never been an issue with a child before. And he wakes up one night in the middle of the night and he wants to have a full meal. And the answer is no. And then people come in to evaluate your final rule, and he says, I asked for food on Wednesday night at 12 o'clock, and my provider didn't give me any. Right?
Yeah,
what are they going to say in that circumstance? Should I just give it to him, or should I not? And will I be written up or cited over something like that?
it's more about like the ongoing practices and not just kind of those like one-off examples where, you know, it happens once. And, you know, as part of the on-site assessment, just speaking from PCG's experience in particular, when you're conducting on-sites and, you know, it's a children's setting, understanding that you're not just going to speak to a 6-year-old, you know, there's guardians in place. There's ways to collect that information and validate it, and, you know, it's all within the context of who you're providing support to.
And so, like, kind of as they wrote the final rule, they really didn't take into consideration, like, tailoring it to that population with those obvious differences. You know, this is very much geared towards an adult with a disability, right? And so that makes a lot of interpretation. And then what if my interpretation is going to be what they want, right? Nobody wants people coming in and citing that. And we want, I mean, I personally want to do the right thing, but is that really up to me to decide what I think is right and what is not wrong? Where is that line?
Well, and I think given the type of services that you all provide in the licensing visits and the other types of violations, so to speak, that you can be cited for, make sure that just when you're filling this out, you're kind of differentiating that perspective from, oh, somebody's just coming to get me or somebody's just coming to find a deficiency. You know, again, this is just an evaluation of where you currently are in terms of home and community-based services criteria. The whole goal is to identify some of these areas and, frankly, some of these nuances where you can say, hey, I provide support to children. You know, what does this really look like for me and my setting, and working with your regional center to make sure that you're getting that targeted technical assistance and support that's going to be more applicable to the individuals that you serve. I mean, this rule it's an all-encompassing rule. When it first came out, a lot of state agencies and advocacy groups that support individuals who are aging spoke up and said, well, this is really more tailored to the DV world. How does this apply to us? We have assisted living units, we have secured memory care units, this doesn't apply to us. Well, CMS has said, actually, it applies to everybody that receives home and community-based services funding. But there's definitely a level of support and guidance that you can seek from your regional center and from the state that kind of help you make it feel like a little bit more tailored process. Access to common areas, kitchen, dining area, laundry, et cetera. I know those are all areas where, depending on the level of support that individuals need in your homes, there may be some blanket restrictions in place. So looking at those restrictions, why are they in place? If nobody can access the kitchen, why is that? You know, is it a commercial industrial kitchen that, you know, really only trained people cook in? And if that's the case, what are some of the other options that individuals have in that setting to maybe make their own meals? Do they have access to a microwave? You know, what types of activities, daily activities that anybody not receiving services would engage in? What are their choices and opportunities to do so? Back to the public transportation question, looking at that access, if there's not public transportation available, what resources are available, and how are individuals supported and educated on what those options are? Again, speak to individuals here. Do they know what those options are? Do they know how to access those options? And are there support staff in that setting that are helping facilitate those choices? Same thing, I think we can skip the overarching question, but again, that's your opportunity to highlight any information that you feel is relevant for your regional center to help assess what your current level of alignment with those characteristics are. Ability to have visitors of their choosing at any time. So really, these are your main subsequent questions. So can visitors visit at any time? Are there documented visiting hours? Are those visiting hours outlined in your residency agreement? Are they posted in the setting? Do individuals or visitors have to sign in and out of that setting? Looking to make sure that none of those practices are more in alignment with practices of institutional settings, like a nursing facility, but more what your home would look like. Are individuals able to leave the setting with visitors? Can they go outside the home? Can, you know, mom or dad or family or friends come pick them up and take them shopping? Can they go away for the weekend or holidays? Again, what do those practices look like? And ensuring that individuals feel like they have those choices and opportunities. We hear a lot of sometimes about 24-hour requirements or notice requirements. Well, you have to give the setting a week's notice or 48 hours notice, et cetera, before an individual can leave the setting. If you have those practices or policies in place, document that here. But that's just going to give the regional center a little bit more information to help them understand how you really allow or maybe discourage visitors or visits outside the home. Yes.
Sorry.
I don't know. It's okay.
It almost got to go the next. So stay with my other children. I'm going to say that if I had to answer this again, I would answer no. Our visitors welcome to visit home at any time. No. I don't want their friends to come over at 11 o'clock at night and knock on the door and expect to come in, right? If I'm running a children's facility, is it within this, will I be violating the final rule if my policy did say, the hours between, 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Require prior permission or a notification, or especially when I'm talking about kids,
So in particular with children's settings, the discussion and conversation should happen with parents or guardians because arguably with children, those, they do have somebody in place that speaks for them. Are those visiting hours and visits restricted for family also? That's something that I would evaluate yourself on. Do mom and dad have to call ahead of time? Can mom and dad not come visit at certain hours? Can family not take that child out of the home? What does that process as a whole look like? And ensuring, again, for younger children that, what is that parent or guardian that's actually in place? What are their thoughts? What are their views? What's their experience?
And for an adult residential setting, usually there's sort of agreements. Everybody makes something, what are called house rules or house agreements, right? And so those individuals, would they live together? Would that cover it?
So the question was about house rules that everybody that lives there agree upon, especially when there are restrictions with visitors, et cetera. I would outline that in your response and say, here's the process for identifying house rules, here's the input that was collected from individuals. Maybe it's a monthly meeting where they vote on those rights or restrictions, et cetera. The key really is, were those house rules made by the individual or were they made by staff? So if there really is that process in place, outline what that process looks like. Because again, that's going to help the regional center be able to differentiate between whether individuals made that choice or whether staff are making those choices for them. Especially in the context, sometimes we see those so-called house rules outlined in residency agreements. Well, that's kind of one of your first indications that that's not really like individuals voting and all agreeing like, okay, we all live here, here's the rules we agree to respect of each other and follow. So yeah, outline all of that information. Yep. Same thing, outline here. All-encompassing question, we'll kind of skip those. But the point is you'll see that for every single one of these areas. So you'll have the federal requirement, you'll see the subsequent questions, and then at the end of each requirement, based on your responses to all of those subsequent questions, how do you really feel you are currently with your level of compliance? Again, keeping in mind that you do not have to meet all criteria as of this moment, and you will continue to receive technical assistance and guidance that help you work through any areas where you don't feel like you're currently in alignment or where you should be or feel like you need to be. Federal requirement 10, so this one, it's pretty straightforward. You're setting physically accessible to individuals. So if you have individuals that utilize mobility devices, et cetera, can individuals access all areas of the home or their residence? Are there certain areas that they can't access if they do need a different level of support? Are there ramps for wheelchairs? And really address this from the context of individuals that you currently serve. Is there anybody in your setting that currently can't access this particular part of the home because their wheelchair can't access it, or they're not able to just navigate that area? Make sure you're outlining that and explaining why. And bathrooms in particular, are there grab bars? Are there areas like if an individual wants to shower? Are there bars in there? You know, what are all of those accommodations that are in place to help ensure that that setting is physically accessible? Understanding that there's other regulations at play here too, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act. The other thing I think we've heard a lot or seen a lot in some of these settings, in some residences there'll be a second floor that has stairs and isn't accessible to any individual that's living in the home. All of their bedrooms are downstairs, and upstairs is reserved for staff. If you have any area like that and it's restricted for those reasons, again, just make sure you're outlining that in your narrative and explaining any of those circumstances. It is any area of the home. So even if you feel like that second floor is not relevant because it's only accessible by staff, still make sure that you're addressing that in your response to your self-assessment. Appliances and furniture accessible to every individual. Again, thinking of if an individual in your setting utilizes a wheelchair, can they still access all areas of their appliances or countertops in maybe their bathroom that they can't access or reach because they utilize a mobility device? Make sure that you're documenting and explaining any of those areas that may not completely be physically accessible to every individual that you currently support. Another quick section, so again, that all-encompassing question, make sure you're outlining any information here that you feel is relevant to support your response to your regional center. Reviewing and submitting. So again, as you're going through, make sure you're saving. Every time you add any sort of information, make sure you're saving it. That way we all know technology never works when we need it. So just on the off chance that you've just spent 2 hours adding a lot of information and you haven't saved anything, just make sure you're saving, you know, every few minutes. Just prevent as much as you can from being lost. Review all of your responses before you submit. Again, as much as you can save and go back to that assessment. Once you click submit, it is submitted. There's not an option to kind of go back in and access and change any responses. So again, make sure you're looking at the self-assessment as a whole before you start responding. You know, do focus groups with individuals and their families. Send them this as a survey for them to respond to directly. You're collecting all of that information before you start really outlining all of your responses. There is a question about if you plan to make adjustments to the way you provide services in order to be in alignment with the HCBS final rule. This is a yes or no question that you'll see appear on the self-assessment. Again, this is very much a choice as a provider as well. So, you know, you as a provider may choose that you don't want to come into alignment. This is an opportunity for you to indicate that back to your regional center. Hoping that nobody makes that choice. As daunting as some of this may seem, you know, again, a lot of you are already providing a lot of this level of support, and you're really close to being in alignment anyway. So a lot of these areas that need remediated really can be handled, you know, I don't want to say easily, nothing's easy with the type of support that you provide. But none of this is so overwhelming, and you're going to get the levels of technical assistance and guidance that you need in order to come into alignment. But again, this is an option. It is a choice. So you have this question that will appear. Verify your responses. So there is an attestation that's built into this. Again, it's a self-assessment process. So this is just your way to attest that, you know, I've reviewed this. I have absolutely included individuals and their families as part of this process. This is a collective response that you've put together in coordination with them, and that you are, all of the information that you've provided is true, accurate, and complete to the best of your knowledge. Click agree, and then save, and you're done. And then the other work begins. Again, make sure you hit submit. If you do not click submit, or if there's any questions that you did not respond to, you didn't check, you met, or didn't meet, didn't provide any narrative, that could be documented as not a complete response. Again, I don't want you to be fearful of an on-site assessment because it's really not a painful process, but the self-assessment in and of itself is mandatory. So make sure you're responding to all of the questions, you're developing complete responses, and submitting a assessment for each service that you provide under your unique provider ID number. Once you've submitted it, you will have the option to print your responses as a PDF. So I highly recommend doing that, saving in another location, printing it, doing both, just making sure that you have an opportunity to go back to what you did respond to, and that's going to help facilitate those conversations with your regional center as well. All right, next step. Regional centers are going to work with you individually to help develop a plan to meet the requirements. So any of those areas that you identified on that self-assessment where you're not fully in compliance as of this moment, your regional center is going to work with you to develop that plan to do, whatever steps you need, whatever guidance you need to make sure that you understand that area, why you're not currently in alignment, and what you can do to make sure you're in alignment by within the time frame that's needed. You'll develop remediation plans. Again, you'll get that ongoing training and technical assistance. And then you could be selected for an on-site assessment. Again, understanding that's just another opportunity to highlight your program and the types of services and support that you provide to the individuals that you are supporting in your setting. One thing that I know we, PCG as a company, have gained from that on-site assessment process as well is a lot of best practices that become useful for other providers. So that is, keep in mind that this on-site assessment process isn't just looking to find areas that you're not in compliance, but we're collecting a lot of really good, useful information that can be highlighted for other providers that are providing similar types of services to say, hey, this is being done, it absolutely can be done, and here's a really good way that you can provide this. The last thing I'll say on the on-site assessment process, obviously a lot more information is going to be forthcoming from DDS. Again, it is a random sample. So there is going to be a statistically random sample that is developed based on self-assessment responses. That methodology and all of that will be determined by DDS. But again, you will be randomly selected. The only settings that will not be randomly selected are those that do not choose to complete a self-assessment. If you haven't received your login information, you haven't heard anything, you don't understand the number of self-assessments that you should be completing, make sure you're communicating with your regional center. Again, you don't be worried about the on-site assessment process, but as the self-assessment in and of itself is mandatory, make sure you're communicating with your regional center to make sure you're getting the valid number of assessments completed, and you've actually received your appropriate login information. These are just some other resources if you have questions about completing the self-assessment. Technical assistance in particular, I know that came up at the very beginning. OIG Compliance Now is the company that is responsible for the technical support to completing the self-assessment. So if you have any issues with access, you can't log in, any of those types of technical questions, make sure you're relaying those back to OIG Compliance, and they can help walk you through that piece of the puzzle. Questions related to the statewide transition plan should be directed specifically to DDS. They have this email address that I know has been in place for a while. You can send all of those questions specifically to hcbsregs@dds.ca.gov. Yeah.
Tab on the portal that anybody can access regardless of whether they have their login information. Is that no longer happening? I'm also hearing that this website is with an email address, HCBS help desk for that.
Yeah, so to repeat the question, it's whether or not within the portal providers can still use the help desk ticket to ask questions. Is that right?
Is this the best way to communicate with OIG, or is it like that also?
Yeah, I think either way, the providers or regional centers can use that help ticket, but this email address is also available. I believe that the submitting a help ticket essentially they get notified through this inbox anyway, so it's in effect the same. But yeah, submit through the help desk, or submit an email here.
So with the technical assistance, we've been struggling getting any responses. So with providers that do not have like the accurate email address listed, we're unable to update that, and we don't get a response from the help desk. So how do we fix those situations?
Yeah, so the question was, that there's, not a quick turnaround on the responses, and you're not able as a regional center to go in and edit, information about your provider, so the email, so that it does go to the correct email. I think, I'm sorry that we're running into that issue. We're doing our best to work through these concerns and these issues. Please, bring them to DDS by emailing that inbox. When you do have sort of widespread issues like that, we're going to do our best to address them, as well as sharing with providers that link within e-billing as well, I think is really important. So making sure that they have that link, because they can go in and access the portal by self-registering while we work through these issues to kind of get caught up.
Does it allow them the ability to update their own email?
Yes, so the question was if providers can go in and update their information. Yeah, once they're logged in, it'll still link them to the information that was pulled from each regional center. So it'll still link them to the correct information, and they can edit their email address, the contact, their information, their if the address is incorrect or things like that, they can edit that within the portal.
A few more things that we want to touch on before we completely wrap up. Here are some other resources. If you have any questions about the final rule, understanding the intent of it, CMS has a ton of information that they have put out over the course of the last 5-6 years related to the rule and really helping understand it. Understanding that it's clear as mud, right? So, but there is a lot of really good PowerPoints. CMS has provided targeted technical assistance to states. There's training series. There's all kinds of information on their website that I would encourage that you access. That's broken down by program type as well. So a lot of good information out there. If you have questions about heightened scrutiny, especially if your setting in particular might be co-located or on the grounds of an inpatient institutional facility, there's guidance out there for really helping understand what that connect should look like, sharing administrative operations, financial operations, et cetera. There's a lot of high security information out there. California statewide transition plan, so this is a link to that document. If you have any questions on what California's plan is, what does their systemic assessment look like that we talked about, what are they doing as a state, and really what's coming up next, all of that information is outlined in that plan. Only a few hundred pages, but it's not a bad read, I promise. And then obviously DDS's website is a really good resource for very specific information related to your programs and the types of services that you provide. The link should be up for the overview training that we've done previously about the HCBS final rule. So that kind of walks through the rule as a whole, what each of those criteria mean, same types of information that you need for addressing the questions within the self-assessment. This is included just as a resource, but these are some of those other common terms that we touched on in the overview training, and just terms that you will hear throughout the series of trainings. There will be other trainings that are coming up after the self-assessment process is completed, but those are just really for reference if you have questions on, things you may hear. Understanding some of these may seem basic to you all, but there are some stakeholders that are impacted by this that don't understand what all of these terms mean. So make sure that we are consistent in the information that we are communicating. Question.
Regional centers can communicate with our providers around when DDS states and so just sitting out there, when the DDS is actually fully up to date with updating all the email addresses and contacts, some of those
Yeah, so the question was, when we think that we'll be able to, be up to date in the portal, in the online portal with, making sure that all providers have, their information correct in there and everybody has access. I don't have a date at this time, sorry, but we're doing our best to make sure that everybody does, because, we realize that the clock is ticking, so.
Yes.
With that being said, is there gonna be a leeway for those that don't receive the information because of this timely or untimely mishap?
I think at this time, the deadline is still March 31st. But I think that we're open to, I think if that's something that's necessary because it's been, providers don't have access for another several weeks or something like that, that's really not the goal. So, we'll be getting everybody in as soon as possible.
Any questions in the chat you think we need to address? So just for people on the phone, if there were any questions that came through the chat box or any other resources, those are things that we can also take a look at and information that we'll provide back to DDS if there's other questions that we need to clarify. Questions back? Yes.
Yeah, regarding the on-site assessments, so those are completed by, who will they be completed by, what will original centers will be in that?
I'll let you respond. So the question was about on-site assessments and who will those be completed by?
Yeah, so the state legislatures gave DDS money to hire a on-site contractor. So there will be a contractor who will be doing those on-site visits in conjunction with DDS and the regional centers, as well as people who receive services. And so we're working on that process now and who that's going to be. Yes, regional centers will be playing a role in the on-site assessments.
So we received some questions coming into the chat through the live stream, so we're just going to go through some of those. This one asks, we are a family home agency with contracts with multiple regional centers. We plan to complete the assessment for each regional center. Is there an expectation that every family home within the family home agency complete an assessment or just the agency?
So I'll answer that question. And I think everybody on the phone could share that, but it was specific to an FHA and whether an agency needs to do an assessment for each home. At this point, it's each vendor's program for each service code. So.
Another question came in. Will federal funding be available to provide individuals access to their choices before the March 2022 deadline for compliance?
So I will say at this point, at the CMS level, so the federal level, there is not a specific funding stream that has been authorized as part of the final rule that will, again, be federal money paid directly to providers to facilitate some of these choices.
Yeah, thank you. You all saw my face. Oh my God.
We've heard this referred to a lot as an unfunded mandate. So I'm sure that's not news. But yeah, when the final rule was released, there was not anything specifically outlined that said, as part of this process, states get an additional certain level of money in order to implement.
And I think, as Amanda stressed throughout the training, really, this is an opportunity for every state, for every service provider to really take a look at how we provide services and making sure that we're really accounting for the experience of the people that we support. So really, looking at it from that perspective, this is an opportunity for us to really get our services the best they can be for the people we support. So.
Yeah, speaking from the federal perspective, these are home and community-based waivers. These are home and community-based settings. That is the funding stream that is behind this. So, what the final rule is supposed to do is ensure that these really are home and community-based settings, that, individuals have those choices, they have that access to the broader community. If they're institutions or they're treated as if they're institutionalized, there's other funding streams for that. But this HCBF funding in particular for these waiver services really should, at a minimum, ensure that individuals have those opportunities.
There are a few more questions coming in, but I think we first want to see if there are any other questions in the room. You want to take a few more? Yes? Okay. There's another question asking about on-site assessment. Will the on-site assessment be scheduled or unannounced?
Yeah, on-site assessments will be scheduled. They will not be unannounced. And I think we have a question in the room.
So for providers, who've been providers for a while, and their program design do not reflect these new final rule things. There's components in them that would violate these, in all honesty, and maybe have to rewrite them. Is the regional center going to be requiring? Are they going to be looking at people's program designs when they come in to see if they're compliant? Because if so, that means that we then have to rewrite some of those components, submit it to our regional center people who have to do all that work. And so I'm just thinking timeline. Is the regional center going to be able to do all that and accept all that? Should we be looking at updating our program design for the areas that might not be in compliance?
Yeah, so the question was about program designs and making sure there's enough time to update them if need be, and whether or not the regional center will be looking at program designs as, I think what you're saying, as new programs develop. And I think that the answer is yes, there will be time, and I do believe that regional centers will be looking at program designs. I think that that's one of the documents listed when we're thinking about, of course, the experience of those you provide services to should be the main source for when you're answering these questions, but certainly the documents that you have to support the services you provide, which, in effect is essentially your program design. And so, yes, regional centers will be looking at program designs and updating those through the regular process.
And I know we mentioned this as part of this training, but you're going through this self-assessment process. If there's an area of your program design that you've identified that, I don't think I'm really quite in alignment with this, you don't have to wait on your regional center to tell you that. You can start thinking through that process and how you may approach that or change that design in order to come into alignment.
Program design 20 years ago were not, it wasn't like a packet that they gave you saying we want this, this, and this. And so for providers who have been doing this for 20 and 30 years, their program design might consist of 3 or 4 pages. In reality, that's just what it is. And so I recently had to re-vendor because I had a licensing switch, and I redid it, and it ended up being 140 pages afterwards. So I'm just thinking about those providers who have older program design, and that just hasn't been something that's really been thrown out there in these trainings about the fact that that might get looked at for a heads up for those providers to start working on it, because it's a huge amount of work. Rewriting the program design to the level that they now require is extremely time-consuming.
Yeah,
and we have a large program, so we were already advised to look at our program designs. We've had some programs for 25, 30 years. And we were told you don't have to re-vendorize the whole thing, rewrite the whole thing, but what you do is you do an addendum to it. And you cite this is an addendum to that, this is an addendum to that.
Yeah, so just to repeat for those on the phone, there was a comment that a provider in the room does addendums to their program design, it sounds like with their regional center as a solution to that.
And as a reminder, that program design and that updated documentation doesn't have to be complete at the time that you're completing the self-assessment. There will be that remediation time period after this where, you've identified those areas that you need to work on to come into alignment. There is time and a process for that, and it does not have to be done, ready, signed, sealed, delivered at the time you submit your self-assessment.
We had a question come in through the live stream. With all these questions, have you discussed it with state licensing other than DDS and regional centers? Some of these questions may violate Title 22 and Title 17 and may cause citations.
Yeah, so I think that's an ongoing conversation that DDS and the sister departments really, as a part of the statewide transition plan, continue to have.
I also just want to address a bunch of questions asking about accessing the training content in particular. For those people at the in-person training, you received the training content as a handout. We're recording the training, so people can access that and reference the training recording. We'll also be sending out the slide deck to everyone that registered and attended in person and live stream, and it will also be posted on the DDS website.
I don't want to completely backtrack, but to the last question about the Title 22 regulations and that being an ongoing conversation. Again, as much as that statewide transition plan might not be the most fun document to read, that information is outlined in there. So you can see what the state's plan is and, what Title 22 regulations they've reviewed, where they feel like they're in alignment, and what changes might be forthcoming. Understanding that document, that statewide transition plan is accessible at any time on the website. And when the state makes substantive changes to that, that will be put back out for public comment. So there's a public review and comment process as part of that as well. Well, Jamie, I'm not going to completely question. Okay. I was going to say, if you want to flip to the next slide, we can still address some questions, but the one thing I want to make sure that I also touch on is the exit survey. So again, when you have the paper copy, but please access this exit survey. Give us as much feedback as you can on this training, positive or negative. We want to make sure that these trainings are meeting your needs and giving you all of the relevant information that you need to feel like you can be successful in completing the self-assessment. So please access the survey, give us all the information, address the questions, and let us know if there are any areas that we can improve or other information that we should be relaying as part of this training specifically. There will be other trainings this week. It's going to be the exact same content that's delivered, but still is understanding that there's also going to be future trainings related to the HCBS final rule. So any feedback, positive or negative you had, please make sure you're providing that.
That was another question that just came in. Is there going to be additional final rule training for us to better understand the final rule? And I think you were starting to touch on that.
Yeah, so there will be more training topics announced. We are working currently with DDS to identify specifically what those training topics are going to be. They will be web-based, so much like you've received information on this training and the HCBS overview training, just be on the lookout for that information that will be coming up. So I'll just apologize in advance if you have to hear me talk for 3 hours on it again, but it's going to happen.
It's a pretty specific question. So if a person does not have access to money and is evicted or asked to leave their home or program, what is their recourse?
Yeah, I would say that's a very specific question that I would consult your regional center on first.
All right, the questions are slowing down, so if you're on the live stream and have additional questions, please keep sending them in. If anyone else has questions here as well.
I would also just add thank you all, not just for attending this training, but obviously the work that you do on a daily basis. It's extremely important and, work that we care about very deeply. So we appreciate the level of support that you provide individuals and want to make sure that we're giving you all of the information and tools necessary to make sure that you don't have any fears or concerns or questions about making sure that you align with the federal rule. I promise at the end of the day, it's not as scary as it can sound. So just make sure that you're coming to us with any questions or, accessing all of the resources in place because they are out there. Yes.
So I understand how this pertains to like clients that are more verbal or they have a conservator or guardian or family member, but what about our clients that are total care? So they're wheelchair bound, they're nonverbal, the communication we get is very, minimal, like maybe they might look at us, a certain direction or they might, move a little bit. But when we're talking about documenting everything in the IDP and the ISP, for instance, like the keys or, what activities or where they want to go, like, does everything, all those categories need to be documented, or does the definition, like, the client is a total care client, we have G-Juice, we have clients that are handset, like, what extent do we need to go on, for those kinds of situations?
I think that within their plan itself, that level of support would kind of be inherent in a lot of what those notes are.
Yeah.
You never want a, diagnosis or a certain level of support to circumvent, at least making sure there are, you've spoken with the family conservator guardian, what are the resources that are taken into account or, in order to serve that individual. But I don't want to get into the whole level of care question because that would be more like at the state level assessment. But I would just make sure that as a provider, you're working with those individuals to the extent possible. You're working with their families to the extent possible and collecting that feedback. And just making sure whether they are total care or they are a little bit more independent, that you don't have people, direct support staff in particular, always speaking for or on behalf of those individuals. Anything else? All right. I'll turn it over to DDS. I don't know if you have anything you want to say to close out?
No, thank you all for being here and, utilize, the resources we provide us in those emails, for questions and, thank you.
Thank you.
That was awesome.